In 2016, a woman had just pulled into her driveway in her quiet neighborhood in Missouri when suddenly her passenger door flung open and in jumped a man she didn't recognize who was wielding a knife. The woman froze in terror, hoping this was just a robbery. But when the man spoke, she knew this situation was much, much worse. 10 minutes later, the police arrived at the woman's house, and what they saw in the hallway of the first floor shocked them. However, the real shocker came a week later when they realized who this man was and why he had gone to that woman's house in the first place. This story starts a bit slow, but then it spirals into madness very rapidly. And that is why this story has become one of the most infamous true crime cases in modern history. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please re-pit the 5-star review buttons pitted olives. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was August 2016, and the weather in O'Fallon, Missouri was typical for summer, hot, sunny, and humid. 58-year-old Pamela Hupp, who lived in O'Fallon, walked to the front door of her neat little 3-bedroom house on Little Brave Drive, and she opened the door. But before stepping outside, she gripped the leash of the family dog and then looked around very intently outside at the other equally tidy upper-middle-class houses that made up her new neighborhood. Pam and her husband Mark had only moved into the Great Warriors subdivision about 2 months earlier, and Pam was still getting a feel for the community. After scanning the street and not seeing any people or cars that were out of place, Pam relaxed and then told herself to stop being ridiculous. It had been a tough few years, but soon she and Mark would have a new circle of friends and acquaintances, and she'd know all her neighbors by name or at least by sight. After all, while Pam and Mark might be new to this particular neighborhood, the couple, along with their 2 kids, had lived in O'Fallon for the past 15 years, and so knew the area as well or better than most of its residents did. In fact, when Pam drove their late-model SUV around O'Fallon, she didn't have to look too hard to find houses that she and Mark had, over the years, bought, renovated, and sold for a profit. Thinking of Mark, with his talent for building things and his passion for fine cabinetry work, Pam smiled to herself. Neither one of them had wound up achieving the dreams they had when they had graduated from high school, but they had done pretty well for themselves in the house flipping business. Pam stepped outside and closed the front door of her house behind her. Then, as she walked down the gentle slope of her wide driveway towards Little Brave Drive, her 1-year-old puppy pulled at the leash, eager for Pam to pick up the pace. As Pam leaned back to keep her balance, she had a flashback to her teenage years when she was a cheerleader and a member of her high school's gymnastics team. Back then, she could have walked a dog and done cartwheels, both at the same time. Now, with the help of her beautician, Pam still had the blonde hair, but the 5'6" curvy athletic body that had attracted so many admiring looks when she was a teenager had since filled out to a comfortable and stocky overall roundness. But despite the years and the added weight, anyone who had known Pam back in her school days would probably still recognize her. She still had that same wide smile, square jaw, and slightly broad nose that made her features strong and distinctive. And when she laughed, it was the same loud guffaw that had often sounded through the halls of Riverview Gardens High School back in 1976. But Pam hadn't just been a good athlete, she'd also been a good student who got good grades. And going into her senior year of high school, she had been just as excited as her classmates about heading off to college. Except that a few of the admiring glances she got back in high school came from one of the most popular and good-looking boys at her school. And shortly after he had invited Pam to their senior prom, Pam wound up pregnant with his child. And 3 months later, Pam was married to him. And by the time her friends were packing their bags for college or some other post-high school adventure, Pam was spending her days inside of a small apartment looking after a very demanding baby. The marriage had lasted 6 years, and while it only took Pam 4 months after that divorce to marry another man, her second choice in husbands had been a lot better than her first. The second husband, Mark Hupp, was a quiet and very likable guy who was 4 years younger than Pam. He had graduated from the University of Missouri in St. Louis, then was drafted by the Texas Rangers professional baseball organization, who promptly sent him to play on their minor league team. But, like Pam's dream of going to college, Mark's dream of eventually getting called up from the minor leagues to the major league club, the Texas Rangers, never happened. So Mark had left baseball and fallen back onto his carpentry skills. And in 1987, the family of 3 added another member when Pam gave birth to their son, Travis. 2 years after that, Pam and Mark had surprised their families by packing up their young family and heading 1,200 miles south to Florida. For Pam, it had been the adventure of a lifetime. She and Mark had settled in Naples, Florida, where they bought and flipped a couple of houses, and they bought and sold some other properties. Pam went back to school and earned a degree in internet technology, and for 10 years, the Hupps enjoyed a comfortable life in the southwestern part of the Sunshine State. Now, using her free hand to push her short hair off of her hot neck, Pam couldn't help thinking about how much had changed since those early days. Even though Pam and Mark and the kids had enjoyed their time in Florida, both Mark and Pam missed their home state of Missouri. So when Pam's mother, who still lived in Missouri, started experiencing early signs of Alzheimer's, Mark and Pam felt that they needed to head back home and be closer to her. Alzheimer's is a brain disorder that slowly destroys memory and thinking skills, and eventually it destroys the ability to carry out even simple tasks like eating. So, in 2001, the Hupps sold their properties in Florida and moved back to Missouri, where they settled in O'Fallon. Once they were back, Pam had worked on and off for years selling life insurance policies for State Farm Insurance Company, while Mark continued to build up their real estate business. 9 years later, in 2010, Pam had filed for disability payments due to neck, back, and leg pain, but when her application was turned down, she just joined Mark full-time in the house flipping business. Now, their daughter and son both had promising careers of their own, and with the responsibilities of hands-on parenting behind Pam and Mark, Pam was hoping that this latest move to their new home on Little Brave Drive in O'Fallon would be their last. She wanted to settle down there. A sudden bark brought Pam's attention snapping back to her dog. She wondered how she would stop and have casual conversations to get to know her new neighbors if her dog was constantly barking and pulling her like this from one tree or bush to the next. A second later, Pam gave herself a mental shake. She had never had any trouble making friends. And if worry over a rambunctious dog was the worst of her problems, then maybe her life really was finally turning around and getting back to normal. Because for Pam, the last 5 years had not been normal at all. In fact, they'd been among the most difficult years in Pam's life. The difficult period had started back in January of 2010, 9 years after they had left Florida to return home to Missouri. That's when one of Pam's best friends, a woman named Betsy Faria, had been diagnosed with cancer. Pam had met Betsy when both women were working at State Farm Insurance back in 2002 and 2003. Even though Betsy was younger than Pam by 10 years, the two of them had similar outgoing and fun-loving personalities. Betsy even had her own side gig as a DJ, a little business she called Party Starters. As they had gotten to know each other, Betsy had come to rely on Pam as a confidant, telling the older woman all about the ups and downs in Betsy's marriage, which included a couple of lengthy separations from her husband. Once Pam had left State Farm in 2003, the two women naturally had less contact with each other, but they still kept in touch. In 2010, after Betsy was diagnosed with breast cancer, Pam and Betsy began spending more time together, and soon Pam was one of Betsy's core people who stood by her side and rallied behind her and her family during such a difficult time. And then later that same year, when the news came in that Betsy's cancer had gone into remission, Pam could not have been happier. But that happiness turned out to be very short-lived. Less than a year later, tragedy had struck again. Betsy's cancer was back, and this time it had spread into her liver. In late November 2011, doctors told Betsy, the bubbly and fun-loving mother of 2 daughters, that best-case scenario, she had maybe 3 to 5 years left to live. And that was only if Betsy undertook yet another course of aggressive and debilitating chemotherapy. And then, just a little more than 1 month after that dire prognosis, and only 2 days after Christmas, Betsy's family and friends received the terrible and shocking news. Betsy was dead. However, it was not cancer that killed her. On the night of December 27, 2011, the day Betsy died, police near the Farias' home in Troy, just a half-hour north of O'Fallon, had received a frantic 911 call from Betsy's husband, Russ, who told police that his wife had committed suicide. But when police arrived at the scene and saw Betsy, they knew there was no way she could have killed herself. While Betsy had been lying on her couch that evening at about 7:30 p.m., someone had taken a kitchen knife, walked over to where Betsy was probably sleeping, and just started stabbing her. And not once or twice. Whoever had stabbed Betsy had just kept on stabbing her body over and over and over again, plunging the knife into her back, her chest, her neck, her face, her arms. And then when Betsy had rolled off the couch onto the ground, the killer had grabbed her wrists and begun slashing away at them. By the time the killer was finished, Betsy would be left with 56 significant stab wounds across her body. Betsy's husband, Russ, would tell investigators that he had spent the evening with friends who lived 30 minutes away, and then when he got home around 9 p.m., that was when he saw Betsy on the floor. He told investigators that he simply didn't notice the 50-plus stab wounds all over her body. Instead, he just saw the slash marks on her wrist and assumed she had committed suicide. But investigators were not buying his story. And 8 days later, police arrested Russ for murder. And at the trial that followed, Pam had been called by the state prosecutor to testify against Betsy's husband, providing information about the couple's marital problems in the years leading up to Betsy's death. 2 years later, in December 2013, a jury only had to deliberate for 4.5 hours before convicting Russ of first-degree murder and sentencing him to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 30 years. Now, even 3.5 years later, in the middle of a hot summer day, Pam felt a chill go down her spine. Pam felt like nothing in her life had been more traumatic than Betsy's death and that trial, especially since Betsy had listed Pam as the beneficiary on Betsy's life insurance policy. When Betsy made the change, she'd made Pam promise to take care of her daughters with the money. Pam had objected and did not want to be put in this role, but Betsy had insisted that it would be a disaster if her girls or Russ got that huge payout. And even after Russ's trial, it seemed like the emotional body blows just kept coming for Pam. At the end of 2013, Pam received a call from her mother's senior living community telling her that her mother, whose memory and overall health had been steadily getting worse, had died. Pam knew that people meant well when they told Pam and her other 3 siblings that maybe in this case, death had been a mercy, given the fact that their mother's Alzheimer's had gotten so bad she could hardly recognize her own children. But for Pam, that didn't change the fact that her mom had only been 77 years old, and that Pam herself had been one of her mom's primary caretakers. And even if her mom didn't always know who Pam was, their visits together had become a regular and predictable part of Pam's life. And then, 2 years after her mother's death, Pam was absolutely shocked to find out that Russ Faria's legal team had managed to persuade the courts to consider some new evidence in his murder case. The new evidence included documents that suggested the state's case against Russ had been built on a bungled investigation, and it would turn out this new evidence was enough. In November of 2015, just 9 months earlier, Russ, the man Pam had testified against and had played a big role in putting behind bars, was acquitted of his wife's murder and released from prison. Pam was horrified. With Russ now free, she couldn't help but feel scared all the time. Would Russ try to hurt her now, to get revenge for her testimony against him? After all, Pam had not held back in court. She had given up every single detail she could possibly remember Betsy telling her about how awful and abusive Russ was, and it really had an impact on the jury. And so Pam knew Russ must hate her. But now, as Pam turned the corner back onto her street and saw her beautiful new house in view, she tried to push those memories away. She knew what Russ looked like, she knew what kind of car he drove, and she had already taken her own precautions. She and her husband Mark, the year before, had bought a handgun, and recently she had taught herself how to use it. With one last look up and down her street, Pam hustled up her driveway with her dog, then opened her front door, stepped inside, and then shut and locked the door behind them. A few days later, on the morning of Tuesday, August 16th, Pam got up, she took her dog for a quick walk, and then tidied up her already tidy house. Then Pam took a deep breath and opened up her front door and stepped outside and began immediately scanning the nearby streets and houses. Luckily, she didn't see any strange cars or people or Russ, and so it was all clear. A minute later, Pam had hopped inside of her SUV, she had backed out of the driveway onto Little Brave Drive, she left the Great Warrior subdivision, picked up Route 70, and headed east. After she finished shopping, she planned to run a few other errands and then drop by her daughter's house. Just a few hours later, right around noon, Pam was pulling back into her driveway. It had been an excellent morning, even if it had turned out that Pam's daughter had not been at home. Pam reminded herself that even if her daughter had been there, they wouldn't have been able to visit for very long because Pam needed to get back home and let the dog out again. But as Pam was about to press the remote to open her garage door, she noticed a flash in her rearview mirror. She turned around and she saw a silver four-door sedan had come to a quick stop right in front of her house by the curb, and a man who she didn't recognize, wearing glasses and a black ball cap pulled down low over his face, was climbing out of the passenger seat. Before Pam could even process what was happening, this man had run up the driveway to her car, opened Pam's passenger door, and climbed inside the car with her and shut the door behind him. A second later, as Pam registered the squeal of tires as the silver car shot away from the curb, the strange man who was now in the car with her pulled a knife out and held it against her throat. Pam could feel the adrenaline flooding her body, and for a second, she was too shocked to even move. As she sat there, paralyzed with fear, the attacker began yelling at her to drive her car to the bank and take out the money she had stolen from Russ. Understanding suddenly dawned on Pam. Russ must have hired this man to do this. Russ wanted Betsy's $150,000 insurance money that Pam had been entrusted with. But then, as Pam thought of this, she wondered if her attacker would actually let her go if she turned over this money. And somewhere deep in her brain, Pam knew the answer to that question. No, this man was going to kill her. Suddenly, Pam's survival instincts kicked in, and using all of her strength, Pam struck out with her right hand and hit the attacker on the face, while simultaneously with her left hand, she fumbled to open the car door. Taken completely by surprise, the attacker lost grip on the knife and it tumbled down onto the floor of the car. By the time he retrieved it, he looked up and saw Pam was out of the car, running towards her garage. But as quick as Pam was, her attacker was even faster. Pam managed to get through the back door that led into the garage, but when she turned around to try to shut and lock it, her attacker had already thrown half of his body into the space between the door and the frame, forcing it open. And so Pam eventually stopped trying to shut the door on him and just turned and ran across her garage and opened the door that led into her house. Once she was inside, she made a quick turn to the right and sprinted into the master bedroom. At this point, the attacker had gotten inside of the garage. He went through the same door that went into the house, but as he went right, he ran so fast he overshot the door that led into the master bedroom where Pam was. And that mistake bought Pam just enough time to get all the way to her bedside table in her bedroom, open up her drawer, and pull out the gun she had put in there. And so by the time the attacker had corrected himself, turned around, and come into the master bedroom, Pam was standing there with the gun held out straight, screaming at him while dialing 911 with her other hand. The time was 12:10 p.m. as the dispatcher at the O'Fallon police station picked up that emergency call. The dispatcher could hear the voice of a woman on the other end of the line calling for help and yelling at an intruder to get out of her house. Then there was the sound of a scuffle and a man's voice in the background, and before the dispatcher could get the caller's address, she heard the distinctive and unmistakable sound of 5 gunshots, all fired in rapid succession. By the time police arrived at Pam's residence just minutes later, Pam was standing just inside of her open garage, clutching the collar of her dog who was cowering and whining at her feet. And inside of her house, the man who had just attempted to kidnap and rob her was dead. By early afternoon, a very shaken and upset Pamela Hupp was sitting inside an interrogation room at the O'Fallon police station, giving police her formal statement describing exactly what happened. and with hands that trembled, Pam pressed her palms together, extending her thumb and forefinger in the shape of a gun, and showed police how, when the man started coming towards her in the bedroom, she had just kept pulling the trigger of her pistol until she had emptied every round into that man's chest. And although Pam could not tell police who the man actually was, she did feel very confident that Russ Faria had to be involved. He likely sent him. She then explained her connection to Russ and why he might want to hurt her or rob her or both. As she recalled the details of the attack, Pam even thought that maybe the driver of that silver car that had dropped the attacker off, that driver might even have been Russ himself. It kind of looked like him, but she couldn't be sure. She only saw him for a second. After giving police all the information she could possibly think of, Pam signed her official statement, and then she was released. Just like Pam, detectives also believed that what happened to her had to be connected to Russ and his recent acquittal. But 7 days after the attack on Pam, investigators had discovered that while the attack on Pam was indeed connected to Russ, it was connected to him in a way that no one was expecting. Based on what the investigators learned, here is a reconstruction of the days leading up to the attack on Pam, as well as what actually went down on that day, August 16th. On August 10th, 2016, 8 months after Russ was released from prison and 6 days before Pam was attacked, 39-year-old Carol Alford was sitting on the front steps of the porch attached to her home in a trailer park just north of St. Louis. The weather that morning was hot and muggy, but Carol didn't seem to notice. She was wearing a long-sleeve lime green hoodie and lounge pants. Her only concession to the heat was that she didn't have on any shoes, and she was letting her dog wander around her little yard while she sat still, rather than the two of them going out for a walk. At around 11 a.m. that morning, Carol was surprised to see a car she didn't recognize pull up alongside her driveway. The driver rolled down the car window and asked if Carol was interested in earning $1,000. The driver introduced themselves as a producer for NBC's TV program Dateline and said that they were looking for people to help them with a reenactment scene that involved staging a robbery, kidnapping, and a 911 call. Carol thought this was a bit odd, but she was intrigued and she wanted the money, so she said, okay. At which point, the driver instructed Carol not to bring her car keys or cell phone. Carol nodded, but narrowed her eyes. Suddenly, this whole thing felt very off. She told the driver she'd be right back, and then she turned around, walked into her house, and into her kitchen. There, she opened a drawer and began rummaging around inside of it until she found what she was looking for, a folding knife. Carol slipped the knife into one sleeve of her hoodie and then walked over to the counter and took out a large kitchen knife from its holder and put that into her front pouch pocket. Then Carol picked up her cell phone, she silenced the ringer, and tucked her phone out of sight in her pants pocket. $1,000 was a lot of money, but there was no way Carol was getting into a car with any stranger unless she felt like she could protect herself. And so Carol, now armed with 2 weapons and her phone, walked back outside and climbed into the car. As the driver pulled back onto the road, they told Carol that they were doing the reenactment at a location that was just behind a nearby strip mall. But after driving for only a few minutes, Carol suddenly felt like she had made a terrible choice, and she needed to get out of that car immediately. So she told the driver that they needed to go back to her house for just a minute because Carol had forgotten to put on her shoes before getting into the car. The driver looked over at Carol's feet, and sure enough, Carol did not have any shoes on, and even though the driver was really annoyed by this, they agreed to go back to Carol's trailer. When they got there, Carol suggested that the driver pull all the way into the driveway, and then as soon as the car was stopped where Carol had suggested, Carol hopped out, and then as she walked towards the door of her trailer, she very deliberately looked up, making sure that the surveillance camera on the corner of her front porch was aimed directly at the front of the driver's car, where it would get a clear picture of the car's driver and the car's license plate. Carol would go inside of her trailer home and then come out a minute later, still barefoot. She approached the driver and said she changed her mind and did not want to do the gig after all. And then Carol looked again, very deliberately, at the security camera that was now peering down directly on both of them. And then Carol turned around and stared at the driver, suspicion written all over Carol's face. As the driver looked at the camera, Carol stepped back and pulled out her cell phone and showed it to the driver and said, "Yeah, I am going to call the police, And yes, that is a security camera, and it's watching you. Without a word, the driver rolled up the window, pulled back out onto the narrow road, and drove away. And true to her word, Carol would call the St. Charles County Police. She told the emergency dispatcher that she just had a very strange encounter with someone claiming to be a Dateline producer, and Carol just wanted the police to know about it. 6 days later, on the morning of August 16th, the day Pam was attacked, the driver who had approached Carol decided to try a different neighborhood further to the south. 40 minutes later, the driver rolled up to a complex of plain two-story brick buildings separated by strips of lawn and central sidewalks. Scanning the scattering of chairs along the various entryways to the apartments, the driver spotted a young man sitting in the shade, legs outstretched in front of him, head tilted back as he looked up at the cloudy sky. In this man's world, $1,000 was a lot of money. He had 2 young children and not much in the way of income or excitement. So, when the driver rolled down the window of their car and explained that they were a Dateline producer looking for someone to reenact a robbery, kidnapping, and 911 call in exchange for what seemed like a small fortune, the young man did not hesitate. A minute later, the young man had hopped into the car, and then on the 17-mile drive west to Pam Hupp's house on Little Brave Drive, the driver of the car carefully explained exactly what they wanted the young man to do. When you get there, tell her to give you the money. Make her drive you to the bank and get it for you, the driver told Lewis. She's gonna try to make a call to 911, and things might get a little physical, but remember, tell her you are there to get the money. That's the most important part. By the time the car reached Pam Hupp's house, the driver's actor for the day was excited and ready to play his part in this reenactment. Little did he know, he was walking into a trap. After the young man had barged into Pam's bedroom, he had tried to follow the script and say the lines that the driver had told him to use, but as he did, he looked up and saw Pam was not only on the phone with 911, but was also holding a gun in her other hand, and she was aiming it at his chest. The young man, believing this must just be part of the reenactment, continued to try to say his lines, but at the same time he began backpedaling into the hall. But before he got there, Pam began pulling the trigger. When police found the young man 10 minutes later, he was lying in a pool of blood, his head propped against a doorway. When police checked his pockets, they found a clear plastic bag containing a handwritten note and 9 $100 bills. Although the man was not carrying a wallet, cell phone, or ID, it did not take police long to find out exactly who he was. Running the dead man's fingerprints through their database of known criminals, police got a match to a 33-year-old local St. Charles man named Louis Gumpenberger. According to police records, Louis had had several brushes with the law back when he was in his early 20s, including a drunk driving charge and a few court entries that involved non-payment of child support for his 2 kids. By August 17th, one day after the shooting, investigators were knocking on the door of Margaret Birch, Louis Gumpenberger's mother. She had just gotten back from filing a missing person report for her son at the local police station. Margaret was devastated when police told her that Louis was dead. But when police went on to explain the circumstances of his death, that he had been shot after forcing his way into a woman's house, Margaret dropped a bombshell. What the police had just told her was actually not possible. Meanwhile, investigators from the O'Fallon Police Department were following up on another lead from the St. Charles Police. 7 days earlier, on August 10th, police had received a 911 call from Carol Alford, who described a disturbing encounter she had just had with a stranger who had approached her at her home and then tried to get her to go with them to act out this weird kidnapping robbery scene for $1,000. But at the time, on August 10th, the police did not act on any of the information she gave them. However, fast forward a week back to August 17th, the day after Louis was killed, and suddenly now, given the weirdness of Louis's actions and the statements given by Pam about what she saw and what she heard, it seemed possible that the mystery driver who had been rejected by Carol had simply moved on to someone else to try to wrap up in their bizarre scheme, and that someone else was likely Louis. And so the police hauled Carol into the O'Fallon police station, and they showed her a lineup of 6 photographs of people they thought could be the mystery driver. And without a moment's hesitation, Carol reached over and tapped a particular picture. "This one," she said. "This is the person who approached me." 6 days later, on Tuesday, August 23rd, police had confirmed that yes, the person who approached Carol was the same person who approached Lewis. And because they had this mystery person's name and contact information, they decided it was time to go arrest them. It would turn out that when Louis Gumpenberger's mother told police that her son could not have forced his way into Pamela Hupp's house, she meant that literally. Louis had been in a terrible car accident in his youth that had left him with a serious and irreversible brain injury. The injury had left him with the mental capacity of a 12-year-old, which made him very gullible and exploitable, and the injury had left him with serious physical limitations as well. Most notably, Louis could barely walk. And so when Louis's mother was told that her son had run up the driveway and barged into Pam's house, Louis's mother knew that could not be true. Louis literally could not run. And it would turn out Louis's mother was correct. Louis did not do any of the things Pam accused him of doing because the story Pam told police about the attack on her had been a total lie. There was never a silver car that suddenly pulled up outside of her house, driven potentially by Russ Faria, that contained Louis, who had then leapt out and charged up the driveway to attack her. What really happened was Pam, aka the mystery driver, had become totally paranoid after Russ was let out of jail. And so, in her crazed, paranoid state, she decided she had to take drastic action to put him behind bars again to protect herself. And so she put together this very elaborate scheme to frame Russ for murder. Then she began looking around town for someone to kill, and she found Carol first, but Carol did not fall for the trap, and so Pam kept looking, and a few days later she found Louis, and Louis immediately took the bait. Pam led Louis into her house on Little Brave Drive while reminding him that the scene they were about to reenact was just that, it was an act, so just say your lines and everything will be fine. And then, once the pair was in Pam's bedroom, Pam said, "Okay, we're starting the scene now." And at that point, Louis began trying to say his lines, while Pam called 911 and turned away from Louis and fished her gun out of the bedside drawer. The 911 operator would answer Pam's call and immediately hear her scream out that there was an intruder in her house, and then the operator would hear a man in the background, which was just Louis fumbling through his lines, and then the operator would hear Pam fire 5 shots into Louis's chest. After Louis was on the ground, either dead or bleeding to death, Pam pulled a note in a plastic bag from her pocket and she tucked it into Louis's pocket. The note was designed to look like instructions Louis might have been given by Russ. It said, "Get Russ's money, kidnap Pam." Carol Alford would ultimately seal the deal that Pam was indeed the mystery driver and Louis's murderer. It was Pam's picture that Carol identified in that 6-photo lineup, and Carol provided police her security camera footage taken from outside of her home that clearly showed Pam's license plate on her car and her face as she drove up in her car to Carol's home on the day she tried to lure Carol to her death. And so, at 11 a.m. on August 23rd, police cars rolled into the quiet Great Warriors subdivision in O'Fallon, and just minutes later, they found Pam. She had just left her driveway in her SUV and had made it down the street before police cars surrounded her and forced her to pull over. Moments later, police approached Pam's vehicle and told her that she was under arrest for the first-degree premeditated murder of Louis Gumpenberger. But this was not the end of the story. Far from it. The reason Pam had been so paranoid after Russ got out of jail was not just because she feared retribution from him. It was also because Pam was afraid that the new evidence presented at Russ's second trial would reveal a new suspect in the brutal murder of her friend Betsy Faria. And that new suspect was Pam herself, the beneficiary of Betsy's $150,000 life insurance policy, a policy that Pam had cashed and then given absolutely none of to Betsy's family. And not only had that life insurance policy been officially signed over to Pam 4 days before Betsy was killed, but also Pam, not Russ, had been the last person to see Betsy Faria alive. 5 years earlier, on December 27, 2011, the night Betsy was killed, It was Pam who had driven Betsy home that evening from her chemotherapy appointment. And it was Pam who had helped get Betsy settled comfortably on the family couch, likely just minutes before Betsy was stabbed 56 times with a kitchen knife. And right after that violent and gruesome murder, it was Pam who fed overly willing prosecutors unsubstantiated allegations that Pam claimed Betsy told her in confidence that painted Russ Faria as an abusive and violent spouse. It was also Pam who kept pushing the theory that Russ must have killed his wife in a fit of rage when he discovered he was not the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. And it was also Pam who kept elaborating on that story and bringing in even more damning testimony about Russ to the state's lead prosecutor, and the prosecution team ate it all up. But Russ knew Pam had been lying the whole time, and so immediately after Russ was acquitted and freed from prison, he directed his lawyers and the press to look at all the evidence in his wife's murder case again. And he started urging the courts to investigate Pam as the primary suspect in his wife's murder. And reporters and lawyers weren't just asking questions about Betsy's death. They were also asking questions about the death of Pam's own mother. According to the official police report, on October 31st, 2013, Pam's mother had apparently died of a fall from her second-floor apartment balcony. But in hindsight, that accidental death was starting to look suspicious. The autopsy revealed that at the time of her death, Pam's mother had ingested 8 times her recommended dose of the sedative Ambien. Not only that, the 77-year-old Alzheimer's patient had somehow fallen through, not over, the railings of her balcony. And not only was Pam the last person to see her mother alive, Pam was also one of the beneficiaries of her mother's $500,000 life insurance policy. Just a few hours after Pam was arrested for the murder of Louis Gumpenberger, detectives sat Pam down inside of an interrogation room and reviewed all of the evidence against her. After they were done going over it, Pam's only response was that she wanted to speak to her attorney. When investigators left the room to call her attorney, a video recording of the interrogation session showed Pam reaching across the desk in front of her and grabbing a ballpoint pen that she slips into the back waistband of her jeans. Video footage also showed that while Pam was sitting there alone, she repeatedly reached up and touched each side of her neck as though searching for the location of her jugular vein. If that vein is punctured or severed, a person can quickly bleed to death. When investigators returned to the interrogation room, Pam was waiting for them at the door, telling them that she needed to go to the bathroom. A few minutes later, investigators heard one of their colleagues screaming for medical assistance immediately. After walking calmly into the bathroom, Pam had taken that ballpoint pen she had stolen, and over again she stabbed herself in both sides of her neck and on the inside of both of her wrists. When officers opened the bathroom door, they found Pam kneeling on the floor in front of the sink, her forehead resting on the tiles. Her shirt was soaked with blood, and more blood spattered the floor and sinks. However, as dramatic as this suicide attempt was, the wounds she inflicted on herself turned out to be non-life-threatening, and so Pam was quickly patched up and sent to jail to await trial. 3 years later, on August 12, 2019, 61-year-old Pamela Hupp was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the first-degree murder of Louis Gumpenberger. 2 years later, in 2017, the medical examiner's office changed the official cause of death for Pam's mother from accidental to undetermined. A year after that, in 2018, the state prosecutor and judge who were involved in Russ Faria's first and badly botched trial were both voted out of office. 2 years after that, in March 2020, Russ Faria, now engaged to Carol Alford, the woman Pam had tried to lure to her death, was awarded $2 million in damages for the wrongful conviction that put him behind bars for 3.5 years. And finally, 2 years after that, in February of 2022, Pamela Hupp was officially charged with murder in the stabbing death of Betsy Faria. According to the prosecutor who was preparing the case against Pam, the motive for that murder was financial gain. If Pam Hupp is convicted of Betsy's murder, the prosecutor has said he will seek the death penalty. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please re-pit the 5-star review button's pitted olives. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 horror stories that are pure nightmare fuel. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Face, and it's about a mother and daughter who spot a lost child on the side of the road while driving home at night. The second story you'll hear is called Just Teeth, and it's about a gruesome discovery made on a farm. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Hell on High Water. And this story has been told many times through history, but this original version I'm about to share is by far the creepiest, because it really happened. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get the follow button a nice fresh cup of coffee. But don't tell them you made the coffee using hot dog water. Okay, let's get into our first story called Face. In 2004, 16-year-old Misty Tasker was a typical American teenager living in Live Oak, Florida, which is a small rural town right in the middle of the state. One Saturday evening in January, she and her mother attended a church service. Afterwards, they hopped in her mother's truck and they got on the country highway and began making their way home. Their house was just 20 minutes down this highway. It was a straight shot. And this highway was pretty desolate. There were no street lights. It was actually a dirt road despite being a highway, and it was just thick forest on both sides of the road the entire way. There were no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver who would keep both hands on the wheel. She would sit up and kind of hunch over the wheel and keep her eyes intently focused on the road. But at night, her driving anxiety would shoot through the roof because she had really bad eyesight. And so she would go to great lengths to not drive at night to avoid that high level of anxiety. But the church service they had just come from had run a little bit long, and so now Misty's mother is driving with the sun starting to set, and she's going as fast as she can to try to get home before it gets too dark. And so as they're bombing down this road at about 55 miles an hour, despite it being about a 40-mile-per-hour zone, Misty, who's in the passenger seat, just happens to look over at her mother for no particular reason. And as she's looking at her, she notices out her mother's window, it looks like there's a little girl sitting on the side of the road. What's a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere? She says to her mom, I think I just saw a little girl. And Misty's mother, who's high up on the wheel, she did not hear Misty the first time. She's just focused on driving and trying to get home. And so Misty says again, I think I just saw a little girl. I don't know what she's doing, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she's okay. And so Misty's mom looks over at her and she's not prepared to turn the car around. That means staying out later, and it means she's gonna be driving in even darker conditions. And so she's like, did you really see someone? Because we gotta get home. And Misty's like, Mom, I'm pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back. And so finally, Misty's mother, she's very annoyed, but she stops the car, she does a 3-point turn, and she begins driving back up the road where they came from towards this girl. Now, they had only made it about a half mile from where Misty believed she had seen this girl. And so pretty quickly, they slowed down because Misty said, I think she's in this area, and they both began scanning the right side of the road because that's where she's going to be now that they've turned around. Now, it was starting to get very dark outside, but there was enough light and they had headlights. They were pretty confident they'd be able to spot this girl. And so as they're slow rolling down the road, they both see this girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was to the road. She had her knees tucked up to her chest and she was rocking back and forth. Misty's mother made a comment that it was a little bit surprising that this girl was out here. I mean, there's really nothing around here. There's no houses, there's no buildings, there's no trails to be walking in this forest on either side. It was just kind of thick forest. And so she just thought it was very strange that this girl would even be out here, especially because there's not any traffic on this road. And so Misty's mother began slowly rolling up to her, and she told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, let's just drive past her and get a look at her, and then we'll turn around and see if she needs any help. And so as they got right up next to her, they realized she was not a little girl. She was a young teenager, but she was not a young child. And as they drove right past her, they would expect her to turn around and acknowledge the car creeping up on her, considering there's no other traffic in the area and you're just some person sitting on the side of the road. You should definitely turn around and see what's behind you. But the girl did not acknowledge them. She just continued to have her knees up to her chest and rocked back and forth. And so Misty and her mother are a little bit freaked out by this, but they drive past her about 50 meters. Misty's mother does a 3-point turn, and when they're looking back down the road where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they're oriented back towards their house now, she wasn't there anymore. But there were no streetlights. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside, and so all they had was the headlights. And so Misty told her mom, drive up a little ways. Maybe the girl stood up and moved and we just can't see her because she's not in the headlights. And so Misty's mom began driving down the road and kind of turning slightly towards the left to shine the light more to the left, but there was no sign of this girl. For good measure, they turned right slightly to shine the lights more to the right-hand side of the road, but there was no sign of this girl. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the road, kind of keeping their eye out on both sides. But after traveling for several minutes, going about 5-10 miles an hour and seeing no sign of this girl, they decided that, well, she must have just gone back into the woods and gone back to wherever it was she came from. And so Misty's mom began picking up speed, and before long they had gone maybe 2 or 3 miles away from where they had seen this girl, and they were coming up to this 4-way intersection with stop signs all around. And as they were getting close, Misty's mother gasped, because on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side, was this girl sitting on the side of the road. She's got her back to the road, her knees are up, and she's rocking back and forth. And so Misty's mother pulls up the stop sign and then just sits there. And both women are just stunned at what they're looking at. They had just seen her 2-3 miles back down the road. It wasn't possible for her to get all the way up here. And so Misty's mother looks at her daughter and says, do you think it's a different girl? And Misty's like, no, that's the same girl. And so they just sat there for a minute until Misty started to panic. And she said to her mom, Mom, don't stop. I got a bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what's going on, but you can't stop next to this girl. But Misty's mom, she was definitely weirded out by this situation, no doubt. But she didn't feel good about abandoning this girl in the middle of the night on the side of the highway. And so even though she felt a little bit hesitant herself, she told Misty, we have to at least drive past her and ask if she's okay. That's the least we can do. And Misty was not having it. She said, Mom, do not stop. I got a bad feeling about this. Don't stop near this girl. But Misty's mom let up off the brake and began slow rolling past this intersection. And now at this point, Misty is just absolutely terrified. And so she takes her seatbelt off and she goes down into the footwell right in front of her seat. And she closes her eyes and covers her ears, and she just continues to beg her mother to just please keep going, don't stop. But her mother just continues on until she stops right next to this girl who's still just sitting on the side of the road with her back to the road. She's got her knees up, she's rocking back and forth. She's not acknowledging Misty or her mother. And so Misty's mother turns to her daughter and says, please roll down your window. And Misty refuses. She's still down in the footwell, still in the fetal position. She's crying and she's still begging her mother to please just go home. And so Misty's mother, frustrated, reaches across the passenger seat. She rolls the window down, and Misty, who's down in the footwell, all she remembers is sitting there covering up her ears, and she's crying, and she opens her eyes, and she's looking up towards her mom, who's reaching over the seat, and her mom yells out to this girl. And Misty remembers looking at her mom, who suddenly recoils in horror and screams, and then they take off like crazy, flying down the road. Misty jumps out of the footwell, and she's looking at her mom, and she's like, "What's happening? What just happened? What did you see?" And her mom's got her hand over her mouth, and she's speeding down the road, and she's crying now, and she's looking at Misty, and she just doesn't have the words to describe what she just saw. And so Misty's asking her mom, "What did you see? What happened?" And finally, her mother just said, "She didn't have a face. She didn't have a face. It was hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me." And so Misty screams, and she's crying, and her mom is crying, and they speed home. They're home just a couple of minutes later, and they run inside, practically falling over each other to get in the house. And as soon as they get inside, Misty's mom calls 911, and she didn't even know how to describe what she just saw. But she knew it was too embarrassing to try to describe it as some girl without a face sitting by the highway. And so she just told the police that they had seen a girl they think needs help. And so the police, they went out and they searched that entire stretch of highway. They looked for any sign of anybody out there, but there wasn't. There was never any trace of that girl. Our next story is called Just Teeth. At around 7:30 a.m. on September 25th, 2012, a 69-year-old farmer named Terry Garner stepped out of his house in rural Oregon to go feed his animals. He stopped first at his enclosed yard, where he spread some seed on the ground for his chickens and turkeys, and then he headed over to his pen, where he was raising four-horned goats, which are goats that grow four horns instead of two. And after picking up some hay and tossing it in with the goats, Terry just stood there and smiled as he watched the animals eat. Terry loved his animals. He actually had previously been a butcher for most of his life. But 6 years earlier, when he had retired, he had kind of gone the opposite direction, basically housing all these animals and treating them basically like people. In fact, he was so devoted to his animals that sometimes when the nearby river would flood, he would move all of his animals into this house he had built on his property just for the animals to make sure they were safe. And if you ever went to visit Terry at his property, it was pretty common to see a lot of the chickens and other birds just kind of hanging out on the front porch of Terry's house. He didn't care. He liked having them around. But of all the creatures that Terry took care of at his farm, the animal he loved the most were his pigs. Now, normally when farmers raise pigs, they grow them to about 250 to 300 pounds, and then they sell them to butchers to be slaughtered. But that's obviously not what Terry was doing here. He loved these pigs so much that he basically just fed them anytime they were hungry, and they were hungry all the time, which meant his pigs sometimes grew to be like 700 pounds, and at no point was Terry going to sell those pigs. He just wanted his pigs to live their best life. So on this morning, after he was done feeding his chickens and turkeys and the goats, he grabbed a whole bunch of food and began making his way over to his beloved pigs. A few hours later, a member of Terry's family arrived at Terry's property and knocked on his door. This family member had called Terry earlier in the day, and Terry hadn't picked up. Now, that in and of itself was not that uncommon. Terry was a busy farmer, but Terry always called people back, and so far he hadn't. And so this family member was here just to check on him and make sure he was okay. And so after a few minutes, when Terry did not come to the door, the family member grew more concerned about Terry and decided they would just walk the whole property and just go find Terry and see what he was doing. And so the family member left the porch and walked all around the property. They saw where the chickens and turkeys were. They saw the goats. They saw the pigs. But that was it. All they saw were animals. Terry was nowhere to be found. It was like he was gone. And so the family member was just about to turn around and head back to Terry's house to see if, maybe he really wasn't there, when suddenly something caught their eye in the pig pen. Now, at first, what they were looking at just seemed impossible. Like, how could that be there? That doesn't make any sense. But when the family member walked over and got a closer look, they knew for sure what they were looking at. And as soon as that truth sunk in, they turned ran to the house and called the police. It would turn out, earlier that morning, when Terry had walked into the pig pen to feed his beloved enormous pigs, somehow or another he had wound up on the ground. Now, we don't know if he had a heart attack or if he had some other medical event or if he simply just tripped and couldn't get up again, but one way or another, he wound up on the ground, and at some point, his pigs devoured him. And so what that family member saw in the mud that caught their eye was not Terry, but Terry's false teeth grinning back at him. Those teeth, along with several pieces of his body and his clothes, were all that was left of Terry. One more haunting detail of this case is that officials were not able to actually figure out whether or not Terry was dead before he began being eaten, or if he was just sort of incapacitated and very much alive when his beloved pigs began to eat him. The next and final story of today's episode is called Hell on High Water. One evening in the middle of March of 1907, a sailor named Nels Nelson stood at the bow of this big Russian steamboat called the Perrier, and he looked out over the Pacific Ocean with a very worried look on his face. The sun was starting to go down, and Nels was afraid of what the night might bring. About a month earlier, the Perrier, the boat that Nels was on, had left Hong Kong and begun its long journey to California, where Nels and the rest of the crew would offload all their hemp and machinery. And just that day, the Perrier had passed by Honolulu, Hawaii, which meant they were nearly to their final destination. Now, their long voyage thus far had been quiet, but now Nels just couldn't help feeling like their luck was about to run out. Nels had been a sailor his whole life. He was originally from Sweden, but he'd traveled all over the world, and a few years back, he had linked up with the Perrier in Hong Kong. And now, other than the captain of the Perrier, who was a Russian named Kavinsky, Nels was the longest-serving member on board the Perrier. And what that meant was Nels and the ship's captain were the only two currently on board the Perrier who knew the ship's dark secret. Now, Nels and the captain had not told anyone this secret and didn't intend to. Now, this wasn't something they planned, like they weren't trying to keep it a secret. Instead, it was just kind of this unspoken agreement that we're just never going to talk about this. But at the last port in Hong Kong where the ship was docked, the previous entire crew of the Perrier, minus Nels and the captain, had all deserted because of this secret. And so now Nels and the captain were left to kind of keep this information to themselves and go out and solicit a new crew to come on board the Perrier to go to California, but they did it without telling these people about this dark secret. And they'd managed to do it. Nels and the captain had found this kind of ragtag bunch of sailors to come with them on this journey, but as a result of recruiting basically anybody with a pulse who was willing to go on this voyage, the crew they ultimately recruited was kind of an untrustworthy, sketchy bunch. On this night, it was Nels's turn to stand watch, which means basically you would stay up and kind of patrol the boat and look out for problems or emergencies. It was just a way to make sure the crew was always safe, even when everybody was asleep. And even though Nels was not exactly thrilled to be staying up all night to stand watch, in a way he actually was kind of relieved to be in charge of this task. He figured he'd rather be awake and miserable than asleep and vulnerable. Suddenly, another sailor came up to Nels, and Nels hadn't heard him, and the sailor slapped him on the back and said, "Hey, how you enjoying your sunset cruise tonight?" Nels turned around and saw it was another crew member just kind of pulling his leg, and so Nels attempted to put on a smile and kind of go along with the joke and make it kind of lighthearted, but he was really struggling because he was looking off to the horizon and he could see the sun had nearly set. For the next couple of hours, Nels and this other sailor would stand by this railing in the cold night air, and they would just talk about, what they're going to do when they get to California and, what they plan to do with their lives generally, and just kind of small talk, normal stuff. And, for a little while, Nels did forget about all this extreme anxiety he was having about nighttime. But at some point, as Nels and this other sailor were just chatting away, there was this warm breeze that kind of came across the deck of the ship. Now remember, it had been very cold all night, and so this warm air really stood out, and the second Nels felt that warm air, he knew his worst fears were about to be realized. And so Nels was so scared about what was about to happen that he just kind of froze. He couldn't even turn and tell his partner what was happening. And his partner was totally oblivious because his partner had never been on the Perrier before and didn't know the ship's dark secret. And so this other sailor just kept on blabbering away, totally oblivious. But then, as Nels is frozen to the spot with fear, from down below in the ship where the crew was all sleeping, they heard this loud, guttural scream like one of the crew members was being tortured or something. And right away, the guy next to Nels, the other sailor who had been with him, he stopped talking because now he knows there's a problem. He doesn't know what it is, but obviously something's wrong. Now, Nels was still frozen with fear because he knows what's happening. He knows what's gonna happen. And so he was just standing there, and the other sailor is like, Nels, what's going on? We gotta go down there. But it wasn't until more screams began coming out of the berthing area down below that Nels kind of snapped out of it, and he was like, all right, come on, we gotta go. And the two of them, they went bombing down the steps down into the berthing area, and they went into the first compartment where these screams were coming from. And when Nels and his partner walked into this room, they looked and they saw two of their crew members were sitting on one of the bunks, just completely rigid, as if they were totally stiff. And the two of them were just screaming as loud as they possibly could in perfect unison, but it was like they weren't there. It's like their eyes were staring off into the distance and they couldn't control their bodies. Now, Nels knew what was going on here, but the partner didn't. And so the partner's looking at Nels like, what's going on here? And Nels just turned to him and said, look, I think we can quarantine them. Help me move them. And so this partner has no idea what Nels is doing. He doesn't understand what's going on, but he kind of jumped into action with Nels. And Nels and this guy, they grabbed these screaming crew members who were totally stiff, and they remained stiff as Nels and the other sailor dragged them out of the room, down the hall, and they put them in what's called the hold, which is kind of like a jail cell on board a ship. It's where sailors who misbehave get sent to. And so it's a place you can put things and lock the door and they don't come out again. Nels' thinking was, if we can take these affected crew members and quarantine them in the hold, maybe, just maybe, this won't spread to the rest of the crew. But as soon as Nels had shut and locked those two men inside of the hold, it was like the entire ship erupted with screams as the entire crew, minus Nels and his partner, just began screaming like mad. It was like the ship was total chaos. And so Nels and the crew member, they began running down the hall trying to figure out where the screaming was coming from. But before they knew it, the rest of the crew were streaming out of their rooms into the hallway, just screaming and running their way upstairs to the top deck. And so Nels began telling himself, stay calm, it's okay, it's not happening to you yet. But then it felt like someone had reached up inside of Nels' chest and was squeezing as hard as they could. It was like his body was being possessed by something, and then he felt this pressure building up inside of him, and then it was like, without even trying, suddenly the loudest scream that had ever come out of Nels came out of his mouth, and he was completely powerless to stop it. And seconds later, Nels, screaming at the top of his lung, along with his partner, who was also screaming, they joined the stampede of other screaming crew members running their way up to the top deck. And when Nels and his partner reached the top deck, as they were screaming and screaming and screaming, Nels looked around and he took stock of what he was seeing. Again, he's literally screaming this entire time and can't stop it. And he's seeing that's what everybody else was dealing with. There were sailors who were clawing at their faces, almost like they were trying to stop themselves from screaming, but that wasn't doing anything. Others were holding their throats, attempting to stop the screaming. Some others were running into walls and grabbing and fighting with each other. I mean, it was absolutely chaos. And so Nels, he's kind of taking stock of this whole situation, still screaming, and then he notices one sailor in particular, and Nels knew exactly what was going to happen. That one sailor, who Nels did not know well, he was one of the sketchy crew members who were picked up in Hong Kong, he stopped screaming. And Nels could tell because there was this look of absolute calm over this sailor's face. And he was down on all fours, almost like an animal, right out in the middle of the top deck. And Nels, as he continued to scream, watched as this young, now very quiet sailor started to move across the deck like an animal. And as he did, he got faster and faster, like he was galloping on all fours, and he was headed straight for the railing of the ship. Now, Nels, in his conscious mind, he knew what was going to happen next, and he wanted to stop it, But just like he couldn't stop his own screaming, he was powerless to stop what was about to happen to this young man. And sure enough, Nels watched in horror as this galloping young sailor went full speed to the railing and then just leapt clear over it and splashed into the water below. And the second he hit the water, it was like everybody on the ship broke out of their trance. The screaming stopped, and it was eerily quiet. And one by one, each of the crew who had kind of broken out of their trance now began looking around, having no idea how they just wound up on the deck and what was even going on. And they looked at each other to try to figure out, like, do you know what just happened? But nobody knew. And then this very tense silence was broken when one of the crew members who had seen that young man gallop and leap over the side, this crew member, he yelled, "Hey, man overboard, someone jumped over." And it was like that was the thing that everybody was going to focus on. We're going to forget about this absolute craziness that just happened, and we're going to try to rescue this guy. But despite lowering down rowboats and paddling around for nearly an hour and yelling out for this guy and turning their ship around over and over again, they never found him. He never made a single noise, nothing. He just vanished into the night, and that was it. And so after about an hour of searching, the search was called off, and this sailor who had leapt over the edge was declared dead. And once he was declared dead, and the rest of the crew were all back on board the Perrier, standing on the top deck, looking around like, what just happened? Nels and the captain looked at each other and nodded, because they knew they would have to tell the crew what just happened. They would have to share this ship's dark secret. And so Nels and the captain told the crew the big secret, and the crew was obviously horrified, but considering they had just been through the entire experience, they weren't exactly surprised. They just hoped that, this night was the only night this craziness would happen. But the following night, the same thing happened. Everybody screamed, went crazy, ran up to the deck, somebody leapt overboard. The next night, same thing happened as well. The next night, so 4 nights in a row of this, the captain just could not take it anymore, and when he heard that first scream echo through the ship, the captain grabbed a pistol, put it to his head, and fired. In early April, the Perrier finally reached San Francisco, California, where the crew was supposed to offload their hemp and machinery. By this point, one of the sailors, whose name was Padaman, had assumed command of the ship. But by this point, the crew were very close to mutiny. They did not want to be on the ship anymore. They didn't care who was in charge. And in fact, once the Perrier got even just within sight of land, there were 9 sailors still on board the Perrier who stole one of the rowboats, lowered it down to the water, and just paddled to land to get away from the Perrier as fast as they could. They didn't even ask to be paid. They just wanted to get away. Nels and the few remaining crew members on board the Perrier docked it in San Francisco, California. They unloaded the hemp, and then the crew actually got back on the Perrier and set sail again and sailed to Santa Monica, California, which was not a very far distance, where they would offload the machinery, so the rest of their haul. And actually, on the morning that they were supposed to actually dock in Santa Monica, the crew's cook leapt overboard to his death at 2 a.m., and the crew barely reacted. Because by this point, this was just commonplace on board the Perrier, people going crazy and jumping over to their deaths. And so once the Perrier was docked in Santa Monica and all the cargo was offloaded, Nels and the rest of the crew just left it there. They totally abandoned it and just left. And the Perrier would remain totally abandoned in this dock in Santa Monica until a reporter from the Chicago Tribune newspaper found out about what had happened on board the ship and the fact that now it was totally abandoned, which seems so creepy, and he decided to dig into this, and ultimately he published the story that I'm telling you right now. Here is the Perrier's dark secret that both Nels and Captain Gavinsky knew all too well. 3.5 years earlier, on a night in the fall of 1903, the Perrier docked in what was then called Bombay, but what is now known as Mumbai, India. And on this particular night, some of the crew members of the Perrier decided they wanted to leave the boat and go have some fun. So a few sailors and an officer hopped on one of the rowboats on board the Perrier, they lowered it down to the water, and they paddled to shore. And apparently, this group of guys had a great time on shore, but at some point, the officer apparently killed a guy. on land. Who knows what it was about? Nobody knows. The reporter from the Chicago Tribune couldn't figure it out. But the rumor goes the officer killed someone, and when they came back to the ship that night, the officer was bragging about killing this person and even making jokes about it. Now, we don't know if this story actually happened, and we also don't really know if this is the seminal event that prompted what would become the dark secret of the Perrier. But very shortly after that officer had killed someone, the Perrier had left Mumbai and they were out at sea and it was very cold. But then suddenly the crew remembered this warm air wafting over the boat, and then screams rang out from inside as the crew began going totally crazy. This was the first appearance of the Perrier's dark secret, which sailors on board the Perrier actually just referred to as the Thing. Nobody ever saw the Thing or felt the Thing or heard the Thing. The only thing they experienced before all hell broke loose is a warm breeze would come across the ship, and then seconds later it was absolute pandemonium until one of the crew members died. And this thing would basically inhabit these sailors and cause them to take their own lives. Over the next few years, more crews would join the Perrier and go out to sea, and over and over and over again, this thing, the dark secret, would take over and many of the crew would end up dying. And so by the time the crew had come to port, the crew would totally mutiny and disappear. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near this ship. That was why Nels and Captain Gavinsky were the longest serving members on board the Perrier, because they were the only ones who were willing to come back. All told, the Thing, or the dark secret of the Perrier, claimed the lives of 23 sailors. 20 of them, after screaming like maniacs, suddenly just went quiet and leapt over the railing into the ocean and drowned, and the 3 others that passed away were the ship's captains, who all killed themselves. After the Perrier was abandoned in Santa Monica, California, it's unclear what actually happened to it, but we know it never sailed commercially again. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see you. Today, I have 3 really good stories that all in their own way demonstrate that sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the Follow Button's car and drive it to the nearest very busy intersection and simply park it right in the middle and then leave. Okay, let's get into our first story called A Bad Habit. On the night of September 11th, 1899, a 23-year-old student named Alice Knott sat in her bedroom in the Washington, D.C. boarding house where she lived, doing what she did every single night, which was to study. So Alice rarely left her room. She'd spent the last few months preparing to take this really important civil service exam, which she had to pass if she wanted to land the stable government job that she desperately wanted. But studying was not the only reason that Alice seemingly never went out. Alice was also sort of naturally a recluse, in part because she had a lot of health issues, like a weak heart and poor circulation, and she just generally got sick a lot. So being out in the world was really tiring for her and also sort of scary. And it was just easier and safer to stay inside. Now, it was getting late in the night, and there was some cold air coming in through her open bedroom window. And it was actually unusually cold outside tonight. And since she got sick pretty easily, she didn't want to risk this draft coming in, giving her a cold or something. So she set her work down for a moment, and she went up to close the window. And then on her way back to her desk, she smiled at the other very important reason that she spent so much time in her room: her beloved pet parrot, Polly. And Polly was sitting on his typical perch, one of the room's light fixtures, and as he saw Alice approaching, he got really excited and began squawking really loudly. Now, Alice knew that basically any minute now, she was very likely going to hear a loud knock at her door about the loud noise, because most of the people who lived in this boarding house with her hated Polly. And Polly, admittedly, was kind of a mean bird. Not only was he really loud, but he bit people and made really threatening noises and had some bad disruptive habits that pretty much drove everybody who lived in the building crazy. Like right now, Polly, in addition to squawking really loudly, was also pecking the metal frame of the light fixture that it was on, which not only made additional noise, but it also damaged the light fixture. Which, to most people in the building, they didn't care so much about the light fixture, but the landlord did. And so it was just this general consensus that Polly is sort of nasty and loud and also damages stuff. So nobody liked Polly, and they really told Alice that she needed to get rid of Polly, and soon, because he is a real problem. But Alice would not get rid of Polly. She loved Polly, and Polly loved Alice. He wasn't mean to Alice. He followed her around everywhere and was very sweet to her, and so Alice she felt very attached to this bird. In fact, in many ways, she viewed Polly as being sort of like her only family. The only reason she was in this boarding house to begin with is because her brother and both her parents had passed away. And so a lot of time, it was just Alice and Polly in this room together. And so it was just a very important relationship. It was like the only relationship that Alice really had. And so Alice just walked over to Polly, who was still squawking loudly and pecking at this light fixture, and she just told him to stop what he was doing. And he listened. He went completely quiet, and, she pet him for a second, and then a moment later, she was back at her desk, back to studying, and for the next few hours, that's what she did, until her eyes got too tired to stay open, and she went to bed. Hours later, in the middle of the night, Alice suddenly stirred awake, and she sat up in her bed. And she had no idea what caused her to wake up. But what she did know is something just felt wrong. Her chest felt incredibly tight, and she actually felt kind of dizzy. And so she got out of bed, and she stumbled her way over to the door to get help. But she didn't get there. After taking only a few steps, her legs suddenly gave out from under her, and she fell to the ground. The next day, just before 1 p.m., the landlord of the boarding house bustled around the kitchen, putting some lunch on the table. And then when he was done and all the food was laid out for his guests, he called out to the house to let everybody know that lunch was ready and to come on down. And a few moments later, all the guests appeared at the table, except for Alice. Now, the landlord immediately noticed this, and it did bother them. I mean, they hadn't seen Alice all morning. However, they did know that Alice typically stayed up late studying, so it wasn't all that unusual for her to sleep in. But even by her standards, 1 p.m. was very late, and so the landlord decided they would just go up to her room and make sure she was okay. And so the landlord went down the hallway to the last door, which was Alice's, and they knocked, but there was no answer. So after trying a few more times and still not getting an answer, they just reached down, turned the knob, it was unlocked, and they opened the door. And immediately, as soon as that door opened, the landlord began to gag. So there were a lot of things about Alice's pet parrot Polly that really concerned people. And Alice, who loved her bird and considered it the only thing saving her from total awful loneliness, sort of looked the other way when it came to all those concerns. However, there was one thing that Alice should not have ignored. and that was her parents' drug problem. So in 1899, interior lighting inside of homes was almost exclusively open flames, and those flames were powered by gas. And it would turn out Paulie regularly liked to inhale that gas. He would basically get high. When he was pecking at the light fixture, he wasn't doing it just to make noise or to damage it. He was doing it to turn the valve in order to suck on this gas until he basically passed out. Now, Alice did know Paulie did this, but she would typically stop him while he was in the process of trying to get high and just kind of keep him from doing it. Or if after he had turned the valve and passed out, she would just move her parrot and then close the valve. Or she would keep her window open to ensure that the gas wouldn't get trapped in her room. But on this night, it was so cold outside, she shut the window, and then she fell asleep because she was so exhausted from all the studying, and it was after she had fallen asleep that Paulie pecked the valve open, got high on the gas, passed out, and then the room continued to fill with this poisonous gas. So when the landlord opened up the door, the reason they gagged is they were hit by this surge of gas that had been trapped inside the room for hours. And then when they looked inside, they saw Alice's body lying on the ground by the bed, not moving, and then at the landlord's feet, flattened on the ground with their beak wedged under the crack at the bottom of the door, was the parrot. Alice would die from inhaling the gas, but the parrot survived because he was able to make his way over to the door and breathe in that fresh air. And so the parrot recovered and would continue to huff gas whenever it got the chance. Our next story is called The Canceled Vacation. Late one night in September of 1993, 43-year-old Linda Gowdy suddenly startled awake inside of her bed in her home in Stoneham, Massachusetts. She had just had this really horrible nightmare about how she was going to die. So in a few weeks, Linda and her boyfriend, whose name was Tim, were planning to go on a Caribbean cruise. And in Linda's dream that she just had, she had been on that vacation, and during that trip, she had basically seen herself dying in a car. And this dream, I mean, it was no ordinary dream. It had been so vivid, so awful, that even now, she knew she was awake, but her heart was still racing. She was still dripping sweat. It was like she couldn't fully escape from this nightmare. And as she's just kind of sitting there with these horrible thoughts in her mind, she began to realize that this was no ordinary dream. This was a premonition. So Linda was a doctor. She was an obstetrician and gynecologist who worked at a hospital in Stoneham, Massachusetts. And by all accounts, she was excellent at her job. Not just because she was smart and experienced, but also because she was just naturally intuitive and had this sort of like sixth sense when it came to her work. In a lot of cases, trusting her gut and going off of her intuition had actually saved the lives of her patients and their babies. And so she had sort of developed a reputation for being this way, and it had led to many patients actually traveling to her from all over the region to have their babies or just to see her in general, because it just sort of seemed like she was the person who could handle any problem, mostly because she would get ahead of it and sort of predict complications and treat them before they became complications. But this sixth sense that she had did not just pertain to work. She also would have, these sort of gut feelings or premonitions, like the dream she had just had, about her personal life. And almost always, her intuition on these things or her visions of the future would pan out to be right. So Linda knew that in order to literally protect herself, she needed to cancel her trip to the Caribbean. And even though she knew this was the right call, it didn't stop it from being hugely disappointing. She'd planned this whole trip. She'd been really looking forward to it, as was her boyfriend, Tim. And also, she sort of felt like this was an important trip for her relationship with Tim. She had been with Tim now for 4 years, and he too was a doctor, and they spent all their time together at the hospital. They both worked at the same hospital. But lately, they'd been struggling and fighting a little bit more. Tim had sort of become pretty overprotective of her. Like he was becoming sort of like controlling. And so it was just sort of exhausting dealing with their relationship issues. And this trip to the Caribbean, she saw as like this easy way to like get out of their normal lives and work on their issues, but in a happy sort of fun environment. It felt like they needed it for their relationship. But now Linda knew she would not only have to break the news to Tim that they were going to go ahead and cancel this trip, but also she would need to go find something else, some other way for her and Tim to reconcile, call it a different vacation or some other outing or something to break the norm, which had become sort of toxic. So on this night, eventually Linda calmed down from the shock of waking up to this horrible nightmare, and she laid back down and she just told herself that she would figure it out in the morning. This was obviously bad, but at least she wasn't going to die in a car crash in the Caribbean. A few weeks later, on the night of September 30th, Linda stormed down the hallway of the hospital where she worked towards her office. Linda was fuming. So she should have been leaving for her trip to the Caribbean with Tim in just a few days, but she had gone ahead and canceled the cruise because of her dream, which Tim was very annoyed with her about. He'd been vocal about the fact that her reason for canceling this trip was ridiculous, and it had made things really tense between them, and it was already tense between them, so this is doubly bad. And now, just a few minutes ago, they had actually run into each other in the hospital hallway because they both worked there together, and they had gotten into this huge fight about the cancellation of this trip, and other coworkers had actually overheard it. And so now Linda was not only mad, but also embarrassed, that other people saw her fighting. And so as soon as she got into her office, she just slammed the door behind her and sat down and tried to focus on her work, reviewing patient charts and other things like that, but she just couldn't. Now, Linda knew that canceling this trip was the right thing to do. She was sure that if she had gone to the Caribbean, she and maybe even Tim would have died in a car. She knew that she was preventing that. But at the same time, she also just hated how this premonition was now further complicating her relationship. And so now Linda just told herself to calm down. She took a few deep breaths and told herself, you have other things that are coming up that will help distract her from the drama of her relationship and this trip. She had a massage she had booked for herself on her day off tomorrow, and she also had her college reunion this weekend. Two things she was definitely looking forward to that so far anyways, she had not had a premonition about, so she had not canceled. Finally, around 8:15 p.m., when Linda's shift finally came to an end and she had left the hospital to make her way home, she actually was in pretty good spirits. Even though she had certainly not resolved things with Tim, they were still very much fighting. This Caribbean trip really had become a pain in both of their sides. Despite all that, Linda was determined that, she's not going to let this be just a constant drag on her life. She needs to just live her life and just go forward, and in time, things will sort themselves out. 4 days later, on the afternoon of Monday, October 4th, one of Linda's friends was driving towards the hospital where Linda worked. And this friend was very worried about Linda, since she hadn't heard from Linda since they spoke on the phone last Thursday, which in and of itself was not a particularly big deal, since they didn't speak every day. But this friend had also spoken to one of Linda's coworkers that morning who was also worried about Linda, because Linda apparently didn't show up for work that morning, and the staff at the hospital were very worried, and they had even sent someone to Linda's house to check on her to make sure she was okay, but she wasn't home. And Linda, she rarely missed work, and if she did, she called in. And so to find out that she hadn't called in and nobody knew where she was, combined with the fact that this friend has not heard from her, the friend is thinking something's wrong here. And so they were going to the hospital to basically get together with their coworkers to just get to the bottom of this, to figure out what happened to Linda. But now, as the friend turned into the hospital's parking lot, she could immediately see that something was terribly wrong here, because the lot was crawling with police officers. They'd completely roped off the whole area, and then there was this one big group of people sort of standing over at the perimeter. And so when the friend pulled up and parked their car, she got out and she rushed over to this group to see what they were all looking at. And when she saw, she just gasped. It would turn out Linda's premonition was eerily accurate, but Linda had misinterpreted it. So on the previous Thursday, when she had left work after that long shift and she's looking forward to her massage the next day and the college reunion that weekend, she's trying not to think about the toxicity with her boyfriend Tim. She heads out, to head back home and just be done for the weekend. But she never makes it home. In fact, she never leaves the hospital grounds, because shortly after leaving the hospital, Linda was attacked and strangled to death inside of her car. Linda had been convinced that the death in the car was going to take place in the Caribbean, and so avoid the Caribbean. What she didn't realize is that it had nothing to do with the Caribbean. It was simply that she was going to die in a car, and she did. Meaning, the premonition she had was right. she did die in a car. The location was just wrong. So Linda's boyfriend, Tim Stryker, was the only suspect in her murder. He had no alibi, and he still went on that cruise to the Caribbean without Linda, right after her body was found. And he was later caught paying a witness to give the police false information about seeing Linda with another man at the time of her death. However, Tim was never officially charged with Linda's murder and denied all involvement. However, he was convicted of perjury and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, where he would die in 2011. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Ring. On a spring evening in 1705, a middle-aged man named John McCall sat by his wife's bedside in Lurgan, Ireland, crying so hard he could barely catch his breath. His wife, Marjorie, had unfortunately just passed away minutes ago from what appeared to be a horrible fever. So John was actually a doctor, and a few days ago, when his wife came down with this fever, even though John had not been able to actually diagnose what was causing her fever, what he did know is that the fever was just ravaging her body and it was going to kill her. And so over the next couple of days, John just had to watch in horror as his wife basically just shut down. And now, in some ways, her death was like a mercy, but it was still devastating for John. In part because he felt so helpless, like he's a doctor and he couldn't save his wife. But now, despite how unfair this whole thing seemed, John had to kind of pick up the pieces. I mean, his wife in many ways was like his whole world. They had kids, they had grandkids, they were only in their 50s, but much of those 50 years have been spent together. And so now it's like he was this lost soul. And so he just looked down at his wife and he just reached out and he grabbed her hand, the hand that he was so familiar with, and he squeezed it. And it was just limp. And it made it even more upsetting that she was really gone. And then he looked at her actual hand and he saw the beautiful gold wedding ring that he had saved all this money for, that they both had loved so much. Just seeing that ring on her finger, on that limp hand of hers, it really reinforced the finality of this moment. He couldn't believe this had happened, but it was real. His wife really was gone. And so now, as John continued to cry and squeeze his wife's hand and just reflect on this horrible situation, he also, in tandem, knew that he had to start thinking about her funeral. He would have to plan it really quickly so they could bury her really quickly. So at this time in Ireland, it was traditional to hold a multi-day wake when somebody died so that friends and relatives could have time to pay their respects before the actual burial took place. But if somebody died from disease, like obviously John's wife had, something had caused the fever, he didn't know what, but it had to be some sort of disease. If that was the case, the wake was off the table, and the person was buried pretty much right away just to prevent the sickness from spreading further. But even though John knew this, he couldn't quite bring himself to face that reality, the idea that his wife would be in the ground as soon as tomorrow. But for right this second, John did not get up and start making arrangements here. He just wanted to soak up the last few moments he had with his wife before she was in the ground. The following day, John stood beside his wife's casket as it was lowered into the ground at their local cemetery in front of a crowd of other mourners. Even though Marjorie, because of the disease factor, had not had a wake, John had still expected to spend this day focused primarily on grieving and thinking about all the things he loved about his wife. But instead, he found himself on this particular day very fixated on something else: his wife's wedding ring. So John really wanted his wife's wedding ring, just to have something to remind him of Marjorie, and he loved that ring. It was something that meant a lot to him. But pretty much right after Marjorie had died, as part of the decomposition process, her fingers had begun to swell really badly, and he could not remove the ring from his wife's finger. Nobody could. Other people tried, they couldn't do it. And so ultimately, the decision was made to just bury her with the ring. And so, of course, that in and of itself was sad for John. He really wanted that ring. But also, as John stood there watching her casket get lowered into the ground with this ring inside, he was worried that now her gravesite could potentially become a target for grave robbers. Now, grave robbing has been a thing as long as there have been graves, but it was especially common in Ireland in the early 1700s when the story took place, because the country at the time was experiencing widespread famine and poverty, and people were desperate. And so things like gold wedding rings inside of graves became things worth taking. And so John just felt like, am I always going to be worried that my wife's final resting place is going to at some point be disturbed? But, by the time Marjorie was actually buried that day and people had sort of moved on, as much as John really wished that ring wasn't in there, that he had it, there was nothing he could do. And so he decided he would just try to honor his wife's memory in other ways. That night, John was back in his home in front of the fire with his kids and his relatives all around him. And they were all crying and laughing and sharing their favorite memories of Marjorie. And then every time someone told a story about Marjorie, they would all lift their drinks and they would toast to her. Now, for John, this was very cathartic. This definitely was helping him grieve. But John was also just exhausted from his grief, and also the whirlwind of the last few days and just how wretched they had been. And so even though people definitely were intending to stay up for quite a while here, John, at some point in a lull in all the stories and laughter and crying, he stood up to head off to bed. But as soon as he did, as he began leaving the crowd and they're all kind of watching him, he heard a knock at the door. And so John sighed and headed towards the door, assuming it had to be one or more mourners who want to come in and pay their respects and just sort of be there for him. But when he opened the door, it was not a mourner. It was something else entirely. And when he saw what was out there, it made his breath catch in his chest, and then suddenly he felt this shooting pain rocketing through his chest. Then he felt his legs buckle underneath him, and before he knew it, he was falling to the ground. It would turn out John had been right to be worried about the fact that his wife was buried with her wedding ring. Because not long after she was laid to rest, word had gotten out that there was this ring inside of her grave, and grave robbers, they dug her up. But just like John and everybody else who tried, the grave robbers also could not get the ring to come off of Marjorie's swollen finger. So they had to cut off her finger to get the ring. But when they did that, a very unexpected thing happened. Marjorie sat up and started screaming. So even though John was a doctor, he had been wrong when he thought she had died. He wasn't the only one. Lots of people thought she had died. However, nobody caught it, and they were so quick to bury her because they were fearful of whatever had caused her fever, that disease, that it would continue to spread, that they buried her while she was alive. Just nobody knew. And then those grave robbers, when they cut off her finger, well, the pain of having her finger lopped off basically jolted her out of this catatonic state she was in, and she sat up and she was fully alive again. But when Marjorie basically stumbled from the cemetery, fresh from her grave, back to her home to tell her husband that, hey, I'm still here, when John opened the door and he saw his wife standing there covered in dirt and missing a finger and looking horrible, he was so shocked and so scared that he had a heart attack, and he actually died. John was buried in the same plot that Marjorie had just been dug out of. And Marjorie, despite what happened to her, she went on to live for many more years, just without her ring finger. And then when she finally did die, she was buried in the same cemetery and was given a headstone with the inscription, "Lived once, buried twice." That headstone is still at Shankill Cemetery in Ireland today. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Locasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Evan Allen and by Luke Baratz. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Locasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Today's story is about a very specific type of criminal that is often portrayed in horror movies, but who rarely exists in real life. However, as rare as they are, they do actually exist. And when they decide to wreak havoc, there's often very little anyone can do to stop them. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please ask to borrow the 5-star review button's phone to make a quick call, but instead log on to their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At around 9:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1992, 18-year-old Danita Gillette finished up her shift at Rally's, a fast food hamburger restaurant in her hometown of Dayton, Ohio. She hung up her apron, she said goodbye to her coworkers, and then she stepped outside into the freezing 19-degree night air. Danita had not driven a car to work that day, so she pulled her plaid flannel jacket tightly around her to keep warm, and then she began to briskly walk in the direction of her mother's house, which was only a couple of miles away. That night, like every other Christmas Eve night, Danita's family had all gathered up at her mother's house to celebrate. The Gillettes were one of those big families that were very close and who always looked out for each other. When Danita had gotten pregnant when she was only 15 years old, she had told her parents and 7 siblings, all of whom were older than her, that she'd likely have to drop out of school and get a full-time job to provide for this child. But her family's reaction was, "Nonsense. We'll help you raise this baby so you can stay in school and get a good job and still have a great life." And sure enough, from the moment Danita gave birth to her daughter, her entire family stepped up and made themselves available to provide childcare anytime she needed them to. Fast forward a couple of years back to that Christmas Eve night in 1992, and since Danita had to work that shift at Rally's, her daughter, who was now 2 years old, had been spending the night with her family at her mother's house. And so as Danita walked, she suddenly had this urge to call her family and just check in to make sure her daughter was okay, and also just to give them a heads up that she would be there in the next 30 minutes or so. So at around 10 p.m., she stopped at a payphone on the side of the road that was only about a half mile from the Rally's restaurant. She fished some coins out of her pocket, she put them into the slot on the phone, and then she dialed her mother's phone number. As the phone rang, Danita likely was thinking about how much fun it was going to be to see everyone that night. She also likely was looking forward to eating some of her mother's famous chili and cornbread that she always made around this time of the year. At Danita's mother's house, her whole family was sitting around in the living room chatting and having a nice time, just waiting for Danita to arrive. At 10 p.m., when the phone rang in the house, immediately everyone in Danita's family assumed it had to be Danita calling to let them know that she was off work and that she would be home soon. So when the phone was ringing, one of Danita's siblings, Rhonda, she jumped up and she excitedly ran into the kitchen and she pulled the phone off the receiver and she said, "Hello?" expecting to hear her sister's very happy voice on the other end of the line, but instead she heard silence. Rhonda said, "Hello?" a few more times, but when she was still met with silence, she shrugged and put the receiver back into its cradle, and then she walked back into the living room and she told her family that no, it was not Danita, it must have been a wrong number. Danita's family would stay up for a little while longer waiting for Danita, but she never showed up, and they never actually spoke to her on the phone. Eventually, the family was so tired they decided to just go to bed for the night. They figured Danita must have gotten hung up at work, which was prone to happen, and so they would just have to wait until the next morning to celebrate the holidays with her. Around the time Danita stepped outside of the Rally's restaurant and began making her walk to her mother's house, Dayton, Ohio homicide detective Doyle Burke was finishing Christmas Eve dinner at his grandmother's house in the suburbs with his wife and their 2 young children. Like the Gillettes, the Burkes also liked to get together with family on Christmas Eve at Grandma's. But much as Detective Burke enjoyed the holidays, he'd been a homicide cop long enough to know that just about every week, at least one person got murdered in Dayton. And so chances were good at some point over the next couple of days, he'd be called into work. And sure enough, that Christmas Eve night, after they were done eating, his pager went off, and he looked at the incoming code and it said, "Call work immediately." When he looked up from his pager, he noticed his wife was staring at him. She knew the drill. She knew he would have to leave. When Detective Burke stepped away to call into work, he was told there had been a shooting on Neal Avenue. The victim had been found near a payphone located about a half-mile away from the Rally's restaurant. Detective Burke said goodbye to his family, he hopped in his car, and he headed over to Neal Avenue. When he got there, he saw a ring of police cars and medical personnel all standing in a circle around this payphone. Burke parked his car on a side street and then he walked over, and when he pushed past the ring of people, he saw the victim on the sidewalk right underneath the payphone. It was a young woman lying in a pool of her own frozen blood. It was Donita Gillette. She had been shot 5 times at point-blank range, bullets striking her in the chest, the legs, and the hands. The pattern of wounds on her body suggested she'd tried to shield herself from the bullets, holding up her hands and turning her head away and crouching back like she was trying not to get hit. After she was lying on the ground, either dying or dead, whoever had attacked her ripped her plaid coat off, they took her sneakers off, and they took her backpack that contained only 50 cents. Scattered around her body were .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, which immediately stood out to Burke. That type of ammunition was distinctive. It was generally only used for target shooting because it was not a very powerful ammunition. However, obviously, it was still lethal at close range. Witnesses in the area said they had heard the shots ring out and then saw 2 young men carrying pistols running away from the payphone. Shortly after Donita's family had decided to just go to bed and see Donita in the morning, they heard a knock on the front door. It was Detective Burke telling them that their Donita had been murdered. They were beyond devastated. They couldn't understand why anyone would ever want to harm Donita. She was such a happy person who everyone seemed to love. They just couldn't understand who would do this. When Burke told the family that Donita had been killed near a payphone, and according to witnesses, her murder likely happened sometime around 10 p.m., as soon as the family heard this, they all thought of that strange, silent phone call that Rhonda had answered around 10 p.m. that night. Had that actually been Donita? Had that been her killer? They didn't know, but it just seemed like too much of a coincidence that they would get a call at the same time that she was killed. After leaving the Gillette's household and filing his report on Donita's murder, Detective Burke arrived back at his home just hours before dawn on December 25th. After catching a quick nap, he spent that morning with his family celebrating Christmas, but his heart just wasn't in it. He had been investigating homicides for years, and so over time he had become somewhat desensitized to all of the violence. However, that morning he just kept thinking of Donita Gillette's grief-stricken family when he had told them the news. He also kept thinking about Donita herself, how scared she must have been when she was crouched down trying to shield herself from her attacker. Her family had shown Burke a picture of Donita when she was alive, and she looked like such a vibrant, happy young woman with this big, infectious smile. It just didn't make any sense that someone would kill her over some shoes and a jacket and a backpack with 50 cents in it. Was this actually a personal attack where they knew who Donita was and they were targeting her, and then afterwards they kind of set it up to look like a robbery? Or was this really a robbery? In which case, again, why are you killing someone over things that are worth so little? Burke kept finding himself thinking in circles about her case. He felt like there had to be more to this than met the eye. And he would be right. That night, just before 9 p.m. on Christmas Day, Burke's pager went off again. There had been another murder. This one had taken place in the northern part of Dayton, roughly 2.5 miles from where Donita had been found. The victim was 19-year-old Richmond Maddox. He was found slumped in the driver's seat of a blue Chevy Caprice that had crashed into a tree on the side of the road. But the crash hadn't killed him. What had killed him was a gunshot wound to the right side of his head, fired from point-blank range. And they searched the car. There was no weapon inside of the car, so this was not a suicide. And they checked the exterior of the car, and there was no entry point into the car from a bullet, which means the gun that shot him had been fired from inside the car. Likely, whoever was sitting in the passenger seat or in the back seat had shot this guy in the head. And considering the car had crashed into a tree, indicates that whoever did this, whoever pulled the trigger, had done it while Richmond was actively driving the car. And so in Burke's mind, this indicated that the person who did this had been forced to do this, because it's extremely dangerous to shoot the driver of the vehicle when the car is still moving, because you're going to crash. And so this person who shot Richmond must have been desperate. Maybe they had been kidnapped by Richmond and they were forced to do this. Burke didn't know, but that seemed like the most logical theory. When police spoke to witnesses in the area, they told the police that they heard the crash and then they looked outside and they saw what looked like a short young woman, probably a teenager, get up from the ground near the car and then start running away with a limp. Even though no shell casings were found in or around Richmond's car that could, in theory, link his murder to Danita's murder, Burke still had a hunch that these two murders had to be connected. They had occurred less than 24 hours apart, so back to back, and the bodies were found less than a couple miles apart. And in Burke's experience working in homicide, coincidences rarely occurred. Things happen for a reason. And in Burke's mind, he's thinking, these murders are connected. I just got to figure out what the connection is. But Detective Burke's investigation into Richmond Maddox's death only seemed to further complicate things. Richmond's family, who were stunned at the news of his murder, had no idea who would want to kill him, or who the girl fleeing the scene could possibly be. The only girl in Richmond's life that the family could think of that might have been in the car with him was his ex-girlfriend, 16-year-old Laura Taylor, who they described as being very sweet and polite. But when Burke went to Laura Taylor's house on the morning of December 26th to interview Laura, he was in for a shock. Laura had apparently not been home in several days, and her parents were very worried. Hearing that their daughter's ex-boyfriend had been killed, they feared the worst, that something terrible had also happened to Laura. But before Detective Burke could even begin to process this new information, that now, in addition to two strange murders, he also now had a missing juvenile, who very well could be the key to solving what was happening, unbelievably, while he's thinking about all these different things, Burke felt his pager vibrate again. There had been another shooting. This time inside of a mini-market convenience store that was only 3.5 miles south of where Richmond Maddox had been found. This time, there were two victims. Both were still alive, but they were in critical condition. 38-year-old Sarah Abraham was a classic American success story. After immigrating to the United States from war-torn Ethiopia, she and her family worked hard and established businesses in the Dayton area that included a restaurant and a few convenience stores. The convenience store where this shooting took place was the location where Sarah spent the majority of her time. On the day after Christmas, while Detective Burke was speaking to Laura Taylor's family, Sarah Abraham said goodbye to her 3 young children and then headed out the door to go open the convenience store for the day. Once she arrived and she opened the store and went inside, a 71-year-old regular named Jimmy Thompson came in and he stood by the register to chat with her about the holidays. And then at some point, a middle-aged man named Jones Pettis came inside as well, and he began browsing down one of the aisles. A few minutes later, a teenage girl came up to the register and tried to buy a pack of gum, but she was 5 cents short. Jimmy cheerfully reached into his pocket and gave her a nickel. She smiled, took the nickel, put it on the counter, and then she took the gum and walked out of the store. Then, a few minutes after the girl had left, 2 young men entered the store, each holding a pistol. Sarah and Jimmy immediately threw their hands up over their head, and Sarah told the gunman, take anything you want. We'll give you all the money we have. Please just don't shoot us. One of the men barked at her to open the cash register and give them all of her money. And so with shaking hands, Sarah reached down and she opened the register. She pulled all the money out. She gave it to them, and then she kept her hands up. She had given them everything they had wanted. But for some reason, the man who had taken the money from her still raised his pistol up. He put it right in her face and he fired 2 shots. One went straight through her mouth and the other went through the top of her head. And then, after she collapsed to the ground, the men began shooting at Jimmy, but amazingly, they missed him despite being right in front of him. And Jimmy, who was thinking on his feet, immediately threw himself kind of over the counter and acted like he had been mortally wounded. And so the gunmen, believing Jimmy was down as well, they turned around and they began walking out of the store. But as they were leaving, they noticed Jones Pettis, who was trying to hide at the end of one of the aisles. And so they just fired at him, striking him in the hand and in the stomach. Then the 2 gunmen left, they hopped in a car, and they fled. Paramedics would rush Sarah Abraham and Jones Pettis to the hospital. Jones would survive, but Sarah would die from her injuries 5 days later. When Detective Burke arrived at the convenience store that morning, the other officers who were already on scene told him that Jimmy and Jones had not gotten a good look at the shooters. They just said that they were 2 young men and that they didn't recognize them. After being told this information, Burke stepped inside of the convenience store to have a look around. He was already operating on the idea that this attack had to be linked to Richmond Maddox and to Danita Gillette, because again, the proximity and time to the other murders was just too much to overlook. That couldn't be a coincidence. And sure enough, right as Burke stepped into the store, this hunch of his seemed to be confirmed, because on the blood-stained ground near the counter were several .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, the same distinctive ammunition type that was used in Danita's murder. At this point, Burke was fully convinced these murders had to be linked. But the victims didn't make sense. It would turn out none of the victims' families had ever heard of the other victims or their families. None of the victims worked together or went to school together or had any interaction at all. It just seemed like the victims were kind of random. But as Burke and his partners were discussing how these crimes could be linked, Burke got yet another call. There had just been an attempted shooting at a Dayton gas station. When Burke arrived, they found this hysterical woman named Kathy Henderson, who earlier had been putting air in the tires of her black 1989 Dodge Shadow. When two young men pull into the parking lot, they hop out of the car and they walk right up to her. They raise their guns at her, and then one of them says, "You're gonna die today." And then the two men just started shooting at her. And amazingly, she managed to not get shot and she was able to run to safety, but the two men stole her car. The bullet casings that were found at the scene of this crime were, unsurprisingly, the same distinctive aluminum variety. Clearly, whoever was behind all of these shootings was not showing any signs of slowing down. And so by now, the shootings in Dayton had attracted so much attention that it was not only all over the local media, but it was all over the national media. This was all anybody in the country was talking about, that there was just these rogue people running around Dayton shooting random people, and the police apparently couldn't stop them. And so panic was spreading like a wave amongst Dayton residents and surrounding areas. It didn't seem to matter who you were or what you were doing. Suddenly, everyone felt like they could be next. On the evening of December 26th, shortly after Kathy Henderson's carjacking was reported, Dayton Police Sergeant John Huber was in his patrol car cruising the northwest neighborhood of Dayton when an all-points bulletin came across his radio. The dispatcher said to be on the lookout for the 1989 Dodge Shadow that Kathy Henderson had stolen, and that if they found it, be advised because the occupants were likely the same people perpetrating all of these shootings all over town, and so they were likely armed and dangerous. Huber had developed a knack for finding stolen cars in Dayton. He knew where all the little cutouts were and back alleys were where people like to stash their stolen cars, and so he decided he would just go looking for the Dodge Shadow. And after only being on the hunt for about 20 minutes, he looked down a dark, quiet street just a mile away from where Danita had been killed, and he saw a black Dodge Shadow parked on the side of the road. When he drove up behind it, he saw it was empty, so he called the police station and asked them to run the license plates. And when they called him back, they told him that the plates did not belong to a black Dodge Shadow. They belonged to a blue Pontiac Grand Am, and that the Grand Am was registered to a 34-year-old man named Joseph Wilkerson. Sergeant Huber was confused and thought maybe he had given them the wrong plates, but then he noticed, parked a little ways down the road ahead of the Dodge Shadow, was a blue Pontiac Grand Am. And so on a hunch, Huber drove forward and he took down the Grand Am's license plates and he called back into the police station and he asked them to run those. And they would come back and they would say, well, it turns out the plates on the Grand Am are the plates that should be on Kathy Henderson's Dodge Shadow. Meaning, clearly, in an effort to cover their trail, the suspects had switched the license plates between these two cars. And so naturally, Sergeant Huber picked up his radio and he asked if Joseph Wilkerson had reported his car as stolen. And after a few moments, the radio crackled back from headquarters that no, Joseph Wilkerson had not reported this car stolen. So Huber immediately became very suspicious of this Joseph Wilkerson person and told headquarters they should really send someone over to Joseph's property to talk to him, since most likely he was either one of the shooters or was involved in some way with all of these shootings. Huber said he would stay put on this road and he would stake out these two vehicles and wait to see if anyone came back to claim them. Detective Burke and his team were the ones dispatched to go check out the Wilkerson property. It was a small single-floor white house that was located only about 2.5 miles from where Danita had been killed. Burke opened the front gate that surrounded the property, and he walked along the pathway up onto the front porch, and he knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. Burke called out that, hey, it's police, you gotta open up, but there was silence in the house. Burke left the porch and walked around to the back of the house and knocked on the back door, but still no one came to the door. However, as Burke and his team stood around the back of the house, they all started to smell something awful. It was this putrid smell that was definitely coming from inside the house. They didn't know what the smell was, but given the circumstances and frankly the urgency to figure out who is behind all these shootings, they decided this smell constituted potential foul play, and so they kicked in the back door and they made entry into the house. Immediately, the smell picked up tenfold. It smelled absolutely horrible inside this house. And just from a quick glance around the inside, it was very obvious this house had been ransacked. Somebody had robbed this house. All the drawers and cabinets had been opened. There was trash and clothing and random pieces of electronics all over the ground. And so the police, they have their guns out. They're scanning around the room and they're yelling out, "Police, if you're here, show yourself. We're coming in." But no one showed themselves. It was all silent in the house. And so the police began carefully stepping through the house, and they eventually turned right and began walking down this one central hallway that seemed to lead to kind of a back room that looked like maybe a bedroom at the end of the hall. And as they're walking down this hallway, the smell is getting stronger and stronger. And then finally they get to the end of this hallway and they look into this room and they can see what is causing the smell. There on the bed in this room was 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson. His wrists and his ankles had been tied to the 4 posters of the bed with electrical wire, kind of putting him in a spread eagle position on his back. He had no clothes on, but he had a pillow over his chest and his head, and on the outside, on the top of the pillow, were 2 obvious scorch marks. Someone had clearly pressed a gun into that pillow and then fired 2 shots through it into Joseph's chest and his head, killing him. And from the look of his body and the smell, Wilkerson had likely been dead for at least several days. Also on the ground was another aluminum shell casing, meaning almost certainly this murder was connected to all the others. But the police still had no clue who their attackers were. Who were these mysterious 2 young men? Who was this young girl who jumped out of that car? Was that Laura Taylor? Was that the ex-girlfriend? Was she kidnapped? They didn't know. None of it made any sense. Who were the victims? They don't know each other. Why are they being chosen? What is the connection? And so because the police were kind of at a dead end and they really didn't know where to take this case, they set up a tip line that night for people in Dayton and outside of Dayton to call in with any information about any of these shooting victims. And over the first couple of hours that this tip line was established, the callers that were calling in were providing nothing of value. But late that night on the 26th, a call came through from an 18-year-old named Nicholas Woodson. And based on the tone of his voice, it was obvious he was genuinely scared for his life. He told police that he thought he was going to be the next Dayton murder victim. When police asked him why, he said, "Because I know who the killers are. There's 4 of them, and I think they're planning to kill me next to keep me from talking to you." While the police spoke with Nicholas, Sergeant Huber was still hiding out in his patrol car, watching the Dodge Shadow and the Pontiac Grand Am from a distance. He was kind of hidden behind some trees. And at some point, he saw movement in an apartment building situated just opposite where these 2 vehicles were parked. 3 young people walked out of the building. They walked down the front steps out onto the road. And as they crossed over the road towards the 2 vehicles, they were illuminated by the streetlight, and Huber could clearly see there were 2 young men and a small young woman. One of the men climbed into the driver's seat of the Dodge Shadow, while the other 2 climbed into the passenger and back seat of the Shadow. As the driver turned the Shadow on and pulled away from the curb, Huber radioed into headquarters that the vehicle was on the move and he needed backup right away, and then he too pulled away from the curb and began following them. After just 2 blocks, the Shadow stopped, and at that moment, Sergeant Huber sped up behind them with his lights on, and immediately the passenger door of the Shadow flew open and one of the 2 men took off running, but the other man and the woman stayed in the vehicle. Huber's backup had not arrived yet, so he couldn't worry about the runner. Instead, he stepped out of his car and stood behind his open car door to kind of use it as a shield. and he aimed his pistol at the driver and he yelled for them not to move. Inside the Dodge, the interior light was now on, and it showed the man was still sitting in the driver's seat, not really doing anything, and the young woman who was in the car, who was in the back seat, she was becoming hysterical, and she was screaming at the driver to shoot him now, shoot him now! But the driver didn't do anything. And then moments later, backup arrived, and they were able to pull the man and the woman out of the Dodge without a fight, and they arrested them both. They were 19-year-old Marvalis Keene, and the young woman was none other than 16-year-old Laura Taylor, the ex-girlfriend of Richmond Maddox, whose family had reported her missing. The police searched the nearby buildings for the man who had run, and they quickly found him. He had gone back inside the apartment building that Sergeant Huber had originally seen the trio come out of before they got into the Dodge Shadow. The runner was 17-year-old DeMarcus Smith, and with him in the building he was attempting to hide inside of was 20-year-old Heather Matthews, and she was actively trying to hide DeMarcus. And so both of them were arrested as well. When all four of them were brought back to the station, the police noticed that Marvalis was wearing Danita's flannel jacket, and DeMarcus was wearing Danita's sneakers. Additionally, while these four were being processed at the police station, a call came in from a team of police investigators who were searching the Dodge Shadow, and they would say that they recovered two guns, a .32 caliber Derringer pistol and a .25 caliber pistol that contained the same distinctive aluminum ammunition that was used in almost all of the murders. The police had just caught their killers, and they would soon find out they had done a lot more damage than the public was aware of. The police would interrogate all four of them that night, starting with Laura Taylor, who they thought would be the easiest to get information from because she was 16, so she was the youngest, and she was considered to be very kind and thoughtful. But Laura would remain silent for the entire long interrogation, and when she was asked at some point if she wanted to take a break to go use the restroom, she just stood up and urinated directly onto the floor and then sat back down again in silence. But Laura was the only one who acted tough. The other three talked, and before long, the police heard the whole awful story of what they had done. It all started back on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve. Laura, Heather, and Marvalis were sitting around together talking about how they needed money. And at some point, Laura suggested they rob a guy she knew, Joseph Wilkerson. She said he probably had lots of nice things in his house, and I know he has a car, so we can take all of that. The other two liked the idea, and so Laura called Joseph and asked him if he wanted to be a part of an orgy with them, and Joseph said yes. So the trio walked over to Joseph's house, he let them in, and then the two girls and Joseph walked back into that back bedroom while Marvalis sat on the couch in the living room. In the bedroom, Joseph laid on the bed and he took his clothes off, and Heather and Laura pretended to start taking their clothes off when suddenly Marvalis, as planned, came bursting into the room with his pistol held out in front of him. He aimed it at Joseph and told him not to move, and then he ordered Heather and Laura to tie Joseph's hands and ankles to the four posters of the bed. Joseph immediately begins to beg for his life and tells them they can take anything they want in the house. Anything in this house, it's yours, just please don't shoot me. Marvalis instructed the girls to go search his house for valuables. And so while Marvalis is standing there with the gun aimed at Joseph, Joseph, perhaps in an attempt to kind of bargain his way out of this, says to Marvalis, hey, I have a really amazing gun, a .32 caliber Derringer that I have hidden in the garage. If you want it, I can tell you where it is. And so Marvalis was totally interested, and he said, yeah, tell me where it is. And so Joseph explained where to go in the garage, and so Marvalis left the room, he went into the garage, and he would eventually find this little gun, this .32 caliber gun. And then when Marvalis walked back into the bedroom with Joseph, he promptly walked over to Joseph, grabbed a pillow, he put it over Joseph's chest. Joseph is just looking up at him, wondering what he's doing. And then Marvalis took this new gun, this .32 caliber Derringer, and he pushed it into the pillow, so it was aiming straight down at Joseph's body. Joseph pleaded with him not to shoot him, but Marvalis pulled the trigger and he fired a shot through the pillow into Joseph's chest. Joseph began screaming, and then he made this guttural sound and his whole body began to shake. And so the other two girls, they heard the sound of the shot, so they came running back into the bedroom. And when they saw what was happening, they just stood there. And then Laura looked over at Marvalis and said, hey, can I shoot him too? And Marvalis says, sure. And he hands her the .32 caliber Derringer, the one they had taken from the garage. And Laura takes the gun. She walks over to the still shaking Wilkerson. She repositions the pillow on his face. She pushes the Derringer into the pillow, aiming right at Joseph's face, and then she pulls the trigger, but it doesn't fire. And so frustrated, she turns away from Wilkerson, who's still making all sorts of noise. He's still shaking. And she walks over to MrBallen and says, "Let me use your gun." And so MrBallen pulls out a .25 caliber gun. It was his gun. It was the gun that used aluminum shell casing rounds. And he hands it to Laura. And so Laura hands him the Derringer. She takes the .25 caliber. And then she walks right next to Joseph again. She grabs the pillow and makes sure it's flush to his face. She puts the .25 caliber gun up against the pillow, aiming it right at Joseph's face, and then she pulls the trigger. This time the gun would fire, and as soon as it did, Joseph's body stopped shaking and he went limp. As the trio stood there staring at Joseph Wilkerson's lifeless body, they all realized something. Killing was actually quite fun. The trio left the bedroom and began eating Wilkerson's food and watching his TV and looking for things to steal, all the while happily talking about how amazing the killing experience had just been. Eventually, though, their killing high had worn off, and they realized that Wilkerson did not have any cash in the house, and really, he didn't have nice stuff in his house, so they couldn't really even sell very much of it for very much money. And so they decided they needed to go rob somebody else to get the money they needed. But first, they recruited another friend of theirs, DeMarcus Smith, to come over and join them. When DeMarcus arrived, he, along with Laura and MrBallen, left Wilkerson's house, leaving Heather behind to watch over the place. The trio walked away from the house towards town, keeping an eye out for anyone who was out alone and could potentially be an easy target to mug. And eventually, around 10 p.m., they spotted a young woman they didn't know standing near a payphone. It was Danita, and she was fishing coins out of her pocket to put into the phone. By the time Danita had finished dialing the number of her mother's house, she heard the sound of MrBallen and DeMarcus come running up behind her, and when she turned around, she saw they had guns pointing at her, so she dropped the phone. Then the two men demanded she give them her shoes, which she instantly did, but then, simply because he thought it would be fun, MrBallen still just started shooting her. So he shot Danita 4 times, and then DeMarcus, who had not been a part of the Wilkerson killing, just immediately joined in, and he shot her a 5th time. After she was laying on the ground, dead or dying, the two men yanked her plaid jacket and her backpack off, and then they ran back to Laura on the other side of the road, and the trio retreated back to the Wilkerson house. When Danita's sister, Rhonda, picked up that phone call around 10 p.m. and was met with silence, that really had been her sister Danita calling, but Danita had died literally seconds before the line had connected. Even though, once again, their robbery target did not yield them very much in terms of monetary value, the friends felt like this second murder was still a really good thing. It was a turning point for them. They felt invincible. Killing was the best high that any of them had ever experienced. So in some ways, it didn't matter that they weren't making any money out of these robberies. It was the killing part they liked. To celebrate their murders, the 4 friends threw a party that night at Wilkerson's house. So Wilkerson's dead body is just literally decomposing in the bedroom. They just shut the door during this party. One of the people who showed up to this party was Jeffrey Wright, one of Heather's former boyfriends. And at some point in the night, Heather and Jeffrey got into this huge argument, and Jeffrey grabbed Heather by the hair and started dragging her into a back room. And so, drawn by the commotion of this, MrBallen burst into the room after them and chased Jeffrey, who leapt out of a window. MrBallen jumped out of the window after him and then began shooting at him, hitting Jeffrey 4 times in the legs as he ran away. Miraculously, Jeffrey would make it to a hospital and he would survive, though he would not go to police and tell them what happened. Seeing Heather's ex-boyfriend get shot excited Laura, and she decided she wanted to shoot her ex-boyfriend too. So the next day, on Christmas, Laura called up Richmond Maddox and asked him if he wanted to have sex with her at a nearby motel. When he said yes, she told him he would have to pay for the motel, so bring cash. Richmond agreed, and when he arrived at the designated meeting place that day, Laura climbed into the front passenger seat next to him, knowing full well she was going to kill him and steal the money out of his wallet first chance she got. But after they took off, Richmond looked in his rearview mirror and he saw MrBallen and DeMarcus following them in a car. Sensing this was a setup, Richmond hit the gas And without any hesitation, Laura pulled out the .32 caliber Derringer pistol they had stolen from Wilkerson. She placed it against Richmond's right temple and she fired. Then she threw herself out of the moving car right before it crashed into the tree. Marvalis and DeMarcus would swing by and pick her up a little ways down the road, and then the trio would head back to their base of operations, the Wilkerson house. At this point, the foursome had killed 3 people and nearly killed a 4th. But while they were very pleased with this, they still hadn't managed to take anything of real value from any of their victims, and realistically, even though the killing was fun, they did need cash. They had no money. So the next morning, on December 26th, Laura, Marvalis, DeMarcus, and Heather decided they would rob a convenience store. So they pulled up in front of Sarah Abraham's store, and while Heather, DeMarcus, and Marvalis waited outside in the car, Laura went in to scope the place out. After going inside and counting how many people were in there, although she counted wrong, she walked up to the counter to buy gum, but she was a nickel short. However, 71-year-old Jimmy Thompson gave her the nickel she needed, and so she bought the gum, she smiled, and she made her way out. When she walked back outside, she hopped into the car, and she told DeMarcus and Marvalis that it was just 2 people inside, the cashier and the man who had given her a nickel. She had not seen Jones Pettis, who was at the end of one of the aisles. So DeMarcus and Marvalis go inside the shop, and they hold Sarah and Jimmy at gunpoint, and after getting all the cash out of the cash register, which was only $40, the urge to kill became too much for Marvalis to control. And so he raised his gun, he aimed it at Sarah, and he shot her in the face. DeMarcus would attempt to shoot Jimmy, but he would miss. And then the pair, on their way out, would notice Jones at the end of the aisle. And even though he posed absolutely no threat to them, they shot at him anyways. After Heather drove them away from the convenience store, they stopped at a gas station for reasons we don't really know, at which point DeMarcus and Marvalis, they see this woman, Kathy Henderson, who's just completely minding her own business. She's putting air in her Dodge Shadow's tires, and they decide they're going to kill her too. So they hop out of the car, they walk over to her, and Marvalis literally says to her, "You're going to die today," and then he raises his gun and he begins shooting at her, as does DeMarcus. But amazingly, they miss her, and so she gets away. She does not get shot, and then they just steal her car. Even though by now the foursome had left behind an astounding amount of evidence that 100% was going to get them caught eventually. Despite that, their only fear at this time was that 2 of their friends, 18-year-old Marvin Washington and 16-year-old Wendy Cottrill, might snitch and turn them in. Marvin and Wendy had been present at that big party at the Wilkerson's house and had overheard the foursome talking about the murders, and the foursome knew they had overheard. But strangely, Wendy and Marvin were not the only people at that party who had overheard them. 18-year-old Nicholas Woodson was also at this party, and he overheard, and they knew he overheard. But for some reason, the foursome had identified Marvin and Wendy as the most likely to snitch. And so Marvalis confronted the pair about this, and he told them they would have to come along for the next murder to prove their loyalty and trustworthiness. And Wendy and Marvin agreed. And so that night on December 26th, Marvalis and DeMarcus drove Marvin and Wendy out to the edge of town to this gravel pit. And when they got there and parked the car, Wendy and Marvin realized they were the next murder victims. They pleaded with Marvalis to let them go, that they wouldn't say anything, they promised, but he wasn't having it. Marvin eventually got out of the car and DeMarcus followed, and DeMarcus told Marvin to get on his knees, which he did, and then DeMarcus shot him in the back of the head, execution style. And so Wendy has seen this happen, so she knows she's next, and she begins screaming and begging for her life, and she grabs onto the inside of the car so as not to get pulled out. But DeMarcus comes back over to the car, he grabs her and starts pulling on her, and then Marvalis as well comes around and he grabs onto her too. And between the 2 of them, they're able to pull Wendy out of the car, at which point Marvalis told her to open her mouth. And eventually she would, and Marvalis put the pistol, the .25 caliber pistol, into her mouth, and he told her to bite the barrel. And then when she was biting the barrel, he pulled the trigger. The killers left the bodies where they fell and just hopped back in their car and headed back into town. Nicholas Woodson likely knew that Marvin and Wendy had just been killed for snitching. And so he's thinking to himself, I overheard them talking about the murders. What's stopping Marvalis and DeMarcus from killing me next? I know about the murders, and they know that. And so that was the point at which Nicholas would call the tip line, and he would say, I know who the killers are. It's these 4 people. And literally, practically at the exact same time that Nicholas was giving this tip, Sergeant Huber had spotted Marvalis and DeMarcus and Laura getting into the Dodge Shadow, which would lead to their arrest as well as Heather Matthews' arrest. After going to trial a year later, Laura Taylor, Heather Matthews, and DeMarcus Smith would all receive life sentences. As for Marvalis Keene, who was effectively the ringleader of the foursome, he would be sentenced to death. His execution was carried out on July 21st, 2009. He died by lethal injection. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask to borrow the 5-star review button's phone to make a quick call, but instead log on to their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please send me a direct message on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that sound impossible. Moments so unlikely, they literally shouldn't exist. Yet, somehow, they do. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Scooped, and it's about a tragedy at sea and then a truly unbelievable discovery that is made after. The second story you'll hear is called One for the Road, and it's about a man's drunken walk home that would take a dark turn. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Her Face, and it's about a woman who wakes up in the middle of the night from a nightmare, only to realize her dreams may be bleeding into reality. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, please swap out the follow button spray deodorant for extremely harmful pesticide. Okay, let's get into our first story called Scooped. In 1956, the SS Andrea Doria, which was a beautiful ocean liner, was considered to be Italy's largest, fastest, and safest ship. But those things would not be what this ship was remembered for. On July 25th of that year, the ship was sailing towards the east coast of the United States when it ran into some very heavy fog. And so, following procedure, the captain slowed the vessel down and turned on their fog whistle. A little while later, another vessel, the Swedish ocean liner called the SS Stockholm, entered the fog as well, but they were unaware of Andrea Doria's position. Now, both vessels were using radar, but unfortunately, both vessels misinterpreted what they were seeing, and so neither of them communicated with the other as they careened towards each other. When visual contact was finally made between the 2 ships, it was too late. A collision was imminent. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the bow of the Stockholm plowed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria, penetrating over 40 feet inside the ship before coming back out again. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria and 5 people on the Stockholm. When the story broke, every major news outlet around the world picked it up, including ABC News in the United States. And the news correspondent that they chose to cover this story was a man named Edward Morgan. and unbeknownst to his coworkers, his 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was on board the Andrea Doria, and just before he went on, he was informed that she was amongst the missing and presumed dead, and there was virtually nothing he could do but wait for more information. And so despite his incredible burden, Edward still went on the air and reported the story without ever losing his composure and without ever mentioning his daughter. But after he got off the air, another story began to develop about the crash. Apparently, a girl who was asleep in one of the rooms on the Andrea Doria that experienced a direct hit from the Stockholm woke up after the crash and didn't know where she was, and she began yelling out for her mother. Meanwhile, a man on board the Stockholm heard the girl's cries, and he ran towards the front of the Stockholm, which is where he heard these cries coming from, and when he got up there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Perched on the destroyed bow of the Stockholm was a bed, and on that bed was a relatively unhurt 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. It would turn out when the Stockholm penetrated into the Andrea Doria, the bow of the Stockholm scooped the bed Linda Morgan was on up and kind of dragged her into the ship, and then when it retracted out of the Andrea Doria, it brought that bed and Linda Morgan with it. When Edward Morgan found out that his daughter was the so-called miracle girl, he was overcome with emotions, and he would go back on the air, and this time he would talk about his daughter and her incredible survival story, and he would also talk about how hard it was to deliver the news when it was about someone he loved. Linda would make a full physical recovery. She only suffered from a broken arm, but she would suffer enormously from survivor's guilt, as her stepfather and her half-sister were both killed in the crash. Our next story is called One for the Road. Late on the night of Friday, September 18th, 2015, a 45-year-old man named Lattori Barman stumbled down a pitch-black street in a small village in central India. Lattori was stumbling because he was very, very drunk. He and his wife had spent most of the night together out at this local fair, having loads to drink and partying, and then at some point his wife had actually broken off and gone to her parents' house in another village, but Lattori had decided to stay out and keep the fun rolling. And so once she was gone, Lattori had gone to a liquor store and had more to drink there, and then now he had finally decided he had had enough, he was extremely intoxicated, and he just wanted to get back home. And so as Lattori stumbled down this road, he could really only see maybe a foot in front of him. Not only because he was so drunk, but also because the streets in his village did not have lights, and so it was totally dark. However, this wasn't unusual for Lattori. I mean, this is where he lived, he'd walked the street many, many times, and knew how to navigate without any lighting. And so he just continued walking along, business as usual. But what did strike him as odd is that, late at night here, as he's making his way home, he thought it was weird that there was a lot of people out on the road. He couldn't really see them because, again, there's no lighting, but he could definitely hear them. Like there was people sort of all over the place, and he also sort of in his intoxicated state saw some lights that, maybe were vehicles sort of moving around. So there was like more activity on this road than usual, but at the same time, this is a main road and sometimes there's lots of people and cars on it, even late at night. So this didn't really strike him as odd enough to stop and investigate. He just kept on walking towards his house. But as he's walking through with all this commotion all around him, at some point he goes to step, but instead of his foot striking the ground again, there's nothing there. And suddenly he feels himself falling and he smashes into the ground, and now truly it's pitch black. He can't see anything, and he blacks out. The following morning, a group of villagers were walking down the same street that Lattori had been on the night before, and as they were walking, now in broad daylight, they looked up ahead and they noticed something odd right in the middle of the street. And at first they had no idea what it was, and so they walked closer to it to get a better look. And as they walked up on this thing, they instantly understood what it was, and they screamed and ran to tell authorities. It would turn out the reason Lattori was hearing and seeing all these people and, vehicles on the street the night before, which seemed sort of out of place, was because there was actually a construction crew repairing potholes in that road. This road was known for being very dangerous because of these deep potholes. And Lattori, as he was stumbling along, accidentally fell into one of these deep potholes, smashed the ground, and was knocked unconscious. And because this worksite was so chaotic and there was all this, movement and there was bad lighting, none of the crew saw Lattori fall in. And Lattori, even after, coming to inside the hole, was too drunk to get out of the hole. And so at some point that night, the construction crew reached the pothole that Latore was in. They didn't see him, and they poured molten tar into the hole and then rolled over it with a roller, all with Latore inside the hole. And so after they were done and moved on to the next pothole, Latore, in his final moments, tried to kind of pull himself out of this tar, but he only managed to get his hand up and out of the tar. And so the next day, the group of villagers that walked down the road, what did they see? They saw Latore's hand poking out of the ground. Latore's body was removed from the street and he was given a proper burial. There were 2 construction workers who were on duty on the night of Latore's death who were ultimately arrested and charged with culpable homicide. As for Latore's family, authorities would give them a compensation payment for Latore's death, but it was only worth approximately $760 US. The next and final story of today's episode is called Her Face. One evening in September of 1885, a young woman named Mary stepped out of the backseat of a carriage onto a dirt road in rural England. She had traveled 100 miles from London to the countryside because her husband's aunt had invited her to come visit. Standing on the dirt road, Mary looked up at the big country house. Then she grabbed her suitcase and walked up to the front door and knocked. Then, a moment later, the aunt's maid opened the door. She greeted Mary and took her suitcase and brought the suitcase to the guest room, while Mary headed straight down the hallway to her aunt's bedroom. When she got there, Mary gently knocked on the door and then opened it up. And when she looked inside, she saw the aunt lying in bed. And, the aunt looked up and saw Mary and she smiled, but she was very old and very frail, not doing too well physically. And, that's part of the reason Mary was here, to just kind of see her while she still could. But the aunt looked up and saw Mary and recognized her, and so she smiled, and Mary came in and sat down next to her, and for a couple of minutes, the 2 women just had some small talk. Mary talked about her journey from London to, the countryside where she was now, and, the aunt talked about what she was up to. It was all just kind of, pleasantries. But at some point, the aunt kind of stopped and looked up at Mary, and she had this obvious look of pity on her face. And Mary immediately picked up on it, and she's kind of looking back at the aunt, wondering what's going on here. And then the aunt just says to Mary, "Really, how are you holding up?" And immediately, Mary, when she heard this, she felt this knot in her throat, and she had to fight back tears. She knew exactly what the aunt was talking about. So even though Mary was a young woman, she was already a widow. Her husband had died in an accident about 2 years earlier, and it had sent Mary into this spiraling deep depression. She was still completely grieving the loss of her husband. He had been the love of her life. And, her extended family and her husband's extended family were all well aware of how badly Mary had been doing. And so they had been extending her invitations constantly to come visit and basically just not be alone. That was the reason, really, why her husband's aunt had invited her here, is because she knew Mary likely wasn't doing well. Now, to Mary, this was nice in a way. She felt very comforted by the family members, and it did seem like people genuinely cared about her. But at the same time, she started to get the impression from basically everybody in her and her husband's family that they kind of expected her to, grieve this loss, but ultimately move on. Like, find somebody else, basically. You're young, like, get remarried, start a new life. But to Mary, she just wanted to be like, no, I'm never going to find anyone like my husband. He was the love of my life, and no one will ever match him, ever. Like, I'm done. I probably will never get married again. Like, he was it for me. And so, at that moment, Mary really just wanted to end this conversation with her husband's aunt. Like, she didn't want to get into how she was feeling about her husband because it was bad. She felt bad. But instead of saying that to her husband's aunt, she just said, "You know what? I'm okay. I'm just totally exhausted from travel, and I'm going to go to bed." The aunt nodded and told Mary that, we'll have plenty of time to visit tomorrow, so go get some sleep. And so the 2 women hugged, and then Mary got up, she left the bedroom, headed to the guest room, she found her suitcase, got on some pajamas, and then crawled into bed. But a few hours later, in the middle of the night, Mary suddenly bolted upright in her bed. She was sweating, she was shaking, she was totally disoriented. It took her a few minutes to even remember where she was. But then finally, when she did and she realized she was safe, she realized she had just had this awful, visceral nightmare that she really couldn't even make sense of. In this nightmare, she was looking out at this huge open field. It's nighttime, and there's nothing but this field. But off in the distance, there was this broken down small shed. It was just sitting there conspicuously right in the middle of this field. And even though Mary was terrified of the shed, she felt this overwhelming urge to go to the shed and investigate. And so it's like with every step as she walked through this field closer and closer to the shed, her fear was rising. And then finally, when she got close to the shed, she began to hear what sounded like somebody moaning inside of the structure. And so now she's really scared, but she keeps walking towards the shed. And then she's right outside. She can't see into the shed, but she can hear the moaning. And she sees her hand just come down and fling the door open, almost like she didn't want to, but her body's acting on autopilot. And then she looks into the shed, and there's this figure tucked into the corner, kind of in the shadows. And it's the thing making these moaning sounds. And it turns, and Mary sees it's this woman, this emaciated, destroyed looking woman, but her face is the same face as Mary's dead husband. And as soon as she saw that, it jolted her awake. And so that's where she was, sitting in her bedroom, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. And so after 15 or 20 minutes of Mary trying and failing to fall back asleep because of this horrible nightmare, Mary finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna go outside, clear my head, go for a walk. I know it's the middle of the night, whatever. I'll bring some brandy along and sip that to calm my nerves and just kind of walk around until I'm calm, and then I'll go back to sleep. So she hopped out of bed, she grabbed her flask of brandy, grabbed her jacket, got her shoes on, and walked out the front door. About 15 minutes later, Mary was walking up a hill with the moonlight casting down on her. She was sipping her brandy as she went and was already beginning to calm down. Now, Mary was used to living in the city, in London, and so being out here in the countryside was so different. It was so beautiful and peaceful and spaced out that she had kind of just begun walking and not stopped. I mean, she originally thought she would just stay on the aunt's property, but already she was well beyond the property lines and was basically just out exploring in the middle of the night, and she was having a nice time. And so up the hill Mary goes. Now, remember, Mary has never been to this area. This is basically an all new place. She has no idea what's over here. And she goes up this hill, she crests the top, and she gets a look at what's up there for the first time. And when she sees what's up there, she freezes. She's looking out at this huge field, basically in all directions. And in the center of this field, maybe a couple hundred yards away, is a single small structure, a broken down wooden shed that looks nearly identical to the shed she had just seen in her nightmare. And as soon as she saw that, she's terrified because she knows it's the same one or it's eerily similar. But worse than that, when she saw it, despite her own fears and trepidations about being up here, she felt herself moving towards the shed. It was like her body went into autopilot the same way it did in her dream. It was like she had to go to the shed, even though everything inside of her logically is saying, don't go. But into the field she goes. She deviates off the path and just starts walking towards the shed. Her heart is beating like mad. And as she's getting closer and closer, she even begins to hear moaning sounds coming from the shed. It's like she's living out the nightmare in real life. She can't make sense of it. She wants to go back the other way, but she can't stop herself. She's just going towards the shed. And then finally she reaches the shed, and now for sure she can hear moaning coming from in this building. And she sees her hand reach down, and she flings open the shed, and she looks in, and sure enough, there is this dark figure tucked in the corner, clearly moaning, like this is her nightmare in real life. But when the person inside the shed turned to look at Mary, it was a woman, but they didn't have her dead husband's face. Instead, it was a woman who practically looked like she was dead or close to death. She obviously needed help. Now, at this point, Mary was kind of relieved. I mean, this whole situation is terrifying, but she was expecting to, somehow see her dead husband's face on this person in the shed. And so when it wasn't, and it was just like a normal person, albeit in a very strange set of circumstances, it was a relief. But now Mary didn't know what to do. It's like she's standing there looking at this woman, having no idea what to do. She doesn't understand how she could have dreamed this and now basically lived it too, like nothing's adding up. But again, it was like her body continued to operate in this autopilot mode. She suddenly had this really intense desire to go into the shed and help this woman. She didn't know who she was. This is a total stranger in the middle of a field in a shed who's moaning and looks terrible. She has no idea what's going on, but in she goes. And she sits down next to this woman who's now kind of eyeing Mary, like, what are you doing in here with me? And Mary says to her, like, hey, what's going on? How'd you get here? What's wrong? Like, what's happening? But the woman, it was clear she wanted to respond to Mary and, tell her what was going on, but, she was too weak. It was like she really was on death's door here. And Mary could clearly see that. Like, she didn't need to be told this woman is in a very bad way here. Now, Mary knew what needed to happen is this woman needs to get to a hospital. but they were nowhere near a hospital, and this woman clearly can't get up and walk. And Mary's thinking, I'm not strong enough to carry this woman to the hospital. Like, what am I gonna do? And Mary's thinking, maybe if I just run and get help and they can come back here, but she's looking at this woman thinking, I don't know if she'll survive. She's probably gonna die soon. Like, this is gonna happen now. And so Mary, again, sort of in this weird autopilot mode, decides, you know what? I'm gonna stay right here with this woman. She can't even talk. She can't tell me what's going on, but I am gonna be here with her. I'm gonna be present with her. And if she dies, I'll be here to support her. And so Mary just made herself comfortable. She took her jacket off. She put it over this woman. And then she began letting this woman sip from her brandy flask to, maybe kind of ease the pain. And all night, the two women just kind of sat there and laid together. When the sun finally rose the next morning, Mary looked over at the woman and saw she was still alive. And in fact, if anything, she seemed like her condition had maybe improved slightly. She seemed maybe a little bit more comfortable. Maybe that was from all the brandy. Who knows? But the woman seemed like she had stabilized a little bit. Still couldn't talk or really tell Mary anything, but she seemed to be doing a little bit better. And so Mary's thinking, okay, the sun's up now. Now I can run out, get help, and get this woman the care that she needs. But before Mary could even do that, she began hearing a stomping sound somewhere outside of the shed, and she realized it was a horse approaching. And so Mary, she bolts out of the shed and she looks over towards the road, and there's a horse pulling a covered wagon going right by, and Mary screams and yells and says she needs help, and a man pops his head out of the wagon and says what's going on, and Mary runs over to him and explains this weird situation, how there's this strange woman over here and she's clearly dying, she needs our help, and the man agreed to help. And so he went with Mary to the shed, he picked the woman up, he put her inside of his wagon, and then the three of them together in this wagon drove to Mary's husband's aunt's house. When they got there, the man carried the strange woman inside of the aunt's house, and then Mary told the aunt's maid to go call for the town doctor, and so she said she would. And so at this point, Mary was actually completely relieved. This was kind of a wild, very unexpected night. She doesn't even know who this woman is, but she's definitely happy that she's getting, some level of care here. But Mary sort of felt like her role in this was kind of diminished now. She's gotten the woman here and she's feeling so tired and weak from being up all night. And so Mary decided she would just take a nap. She had been up all night with this woman. She was exhausted. So into her bedroom she went, she climbed into bed, and as she's laying there, she realized she wasn't just tired, she actually felt kind of sick, like ill. And over the next few hours, as she kind of tossed and turned in her bed, not really able to sleep, she would develop this horrible fever. And this fever would just get worse and worse and worse, and Mary would become bedridden, dealing with this mystery illness for weeks, just drifting in and out of consciousness the whole time. It was October by the time Mary's fever finally broke. And on the day that it did, when Mary opened her eyes in this bed, she was clear-headed for the first time. Really, it had been a very rough stretch of a few weeks. And so she's looking around the room, kind of taking stock of her environment, and she sees there's this strange person sitting in a chair in the corner. And her immediate reaction is, oh, this must be like a nurse or a doctor or somebody here that's kind of overseeing me. Mary was aware she had been very sick for several weeks and there were people in and out of the room, but she looked back at this person and realized she actually knew who it was. It was the woman she had rescued from the shed on the night she got sick. It was that woman. But now she wasn't sickly and dying. The woman looked completely healthy and happy, and she was smiling ear to ear at Mary. Like, this didn't make any sense. Like, what's going on here? And also, Mary just couldn't help but think, like, wait a minute, why is this woman still here? It has been weeks since I rescued her from the shed. Why is she still here? Like, nothing's adding up. But before Mary could ask any questions, this woman, who clearly was super excited to see that Mary was now fully awake and attentive, this woman just starts talking a mile a minute. Like she had been waiting to dump all this information on Mary as soon as she was well. Like clearly this woman has been waiting diligently for her chance to tell her story. And the story that she dumped on Mary at her first chance, like this day, was incredible. The woman told her that a couple of years earlier, she had boarded the ship in England that was bound for Brazil. But about 5 days into their journey, while they're out on the open sea, the ship caught fire. This horrible fire, everyone's trying to evacuate, and this woman said she was in her bedroom, asleep. She didn't even know what was happening. And while she's laying there and the ship is catching fire and beginning to sink, this stranger comes barreling into the room, literally wakes her up, scoops her up, and takes her to the top deck and gets her into a lifeboat right as the ship sinks. I mean, this stranger completely saved this woman's life. And so this woman, the stranger who had saved her, and a handful of other lucky people who had made it onto this lifeboat just began rowing in a single direction, hoping they'd find land. And luckily they did. They found this deserted island. And so they landed there, and for a year, this woman and the stranger and those few people subsisted on this island, barely clinging to life, praying for rescue. And amazingly, after a year of being shipwrecked, they flagged down a ship that did rescue them and brought them to England. However, when they actually got to England, things weren't that good. The stranger who had saved this woman had basically lost his mind from living on this island, not expecting to be rescued. Even though they got rescued, it was like he wasn't coherent anymore. He had lost it. Not to mention he was really ill from the way they were living on this island, scavenging things that weren't necessarily edible, but just to survive, they were eating whatever they could. It was a very rough lifestyle. And this man, he just hadn't really handled it well. And so he got thrown in a hospital and placed in a particular ward for people that were mentally unwell, and he was basically forgotten about. However, the woman would tell Mary that, when this happened, she felt awful because she felt like this stranger had saved her life and she kind of owed him a debt. And so she decided it would be her mission to find the stranger's family and let them know where he was. And so the woman said she did some research and she figured out where one of his relatives lived. It was really far away on the other side of England. And so she spent all her money, using every vehicle she possibly could, every ride she could take, getting as close to this location as she possibly could. And then when she ran out of money, she just kept on walking towards this destination. And she kept going until she literally ran out of food and water, but she wasn't quite there yet. She knew she was getting close and she's just walking and she's basically falling apart, so hell-bent on finding this family member for this stranger, but she can't quite make it. She can't quite get to the family member's house. And that's when she finds this shed out in the middle of the field where she just collapses, thinking, okay, this is where I'm gonna die. And so back in the guest room, Mary is listening to this woman tell this unbelievable story, and at some point the woman just kind of stops when she gets to the shed scene. And Mary's looking at her like, I don't really understand where you're going with this. I don't understand why you're here telling me this. And the woman, she just starts to laugh, like this joyous laughter, just nonstop laughter. And then she goes, don't you get it? And then seconds later, Mary hears footsteps and a man walks into the bedroom, and it's Mary's husband. He was the stranger who rescued that woman. He didn't die in an accident 2 years ago like they thought. He was in a shipwreck, but he survived. He was the man who got thrown in the hospital and forgotten about. And it was this woman who was making the journey to his aunt's house to tell her that he was still alive. And it was only because Mary had that totally bizarre nightmare that sort of led her to that shed that she found this woman who would have died in that shed and never quite gotten to the aunt's house, and so never could have told the family, never could have told Mary that her husband's still alive. It was because of that dream that fate aligned, and now her husband was back. Mary and her husband's story wound up being published in newspapers all over the world. People really could not get enough of this story. But despite how far-reaching this story became, nobody was ever able to come up with a logical explanation for how so many coincidences and this crazy dream Mary had, how it all came together to reunite Mary and her husband. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/podcast plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.